Welcome, my dear listener. Tonight, I shall tell you of an age when the world was young, and the stars were closer to men's hearts. I have walked through many winters across the centuries, but few compare to those that gripped the lands of ancient Rus. Picture, if you will, a world where cold was not merely discomfort, but a living force, an adversary that tested every soul from the first frost of autumn until the thaw of late spring. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the principalities of Novgorod and Pskov, the forests of Muscovy, these were realms where survival itself became an art form, practiced nightly in the darkness. The winter of the year 1067 was among the first I recall chroniclers noting with particular dread. They wrote simply that it was snowy and severe, words that seem plain to modern ears but carried weight like iron chains to those who lived through it. I remember walking through those snows, watching families huddle in their wooden dwellings, smoke rising from chimneys, like prayers ascending to an indifferent sky. The cold bit through fur and wool, turned breath to ice crystals in the air, and made every step outside a calculation of risk. But it was the 15th century that truly revealed winter's cruelty. In the year 1408, snow fell so thick that villages vanished beneath white blankets, taller than a man. The winter of 1417 brought cold so hard and heavy that people in Novgorod and Pskov were buried alive when snow collapsed upon them as they slept. Can you imagine it? Drifting into slumber and never waking, claimed not by illness or age, but by the sheer weight of winter pressing down through wooden roofs and earthen walls. The year 1442 saw frost and ice kill many people outright. The chronicles do not elaborate, they rarely did, on matters considered routine, but I recall the stillness of that season, how even the wolves grew quiet, how birds fell frozen from branches, how the very air seemed to sharpen into blades. And then came 1446, when Moscow state experienced frosts that persisted all season long, with snow depths reaching to full meters. Imagine opening your door to a wall of white, having to tunnel upward to reach daylight, your world reduced to narrow passages carved through drifts that towered over your head. In 1461, winter arrived with severe snowstorms that lasted weeks without pause. The wind howled like a living thing, voices in the darkness that seemed almost to speak, though their words were only promises of cold. Western Siberia, that vast expanse where the earth itself seemed to stretch into eternity. New winters that were longer and snowier still during what scholars now call the Little Ice Age. Autumn frosts came early, killing crops before harvest, and spring delayed her arrival until hope had grown thin as parchment. These were not merely inconveniences. This was an environment that actively sought to extinguish human life. To survive a single night required knowledge passed down through generations, communal effort, and a kind of stubborn resilience that we, in warmer times, can scarcely fathom. The cold crept through every crack, seeped through every wall, and turned stone chambers into tombs if one was not vigilant. I have seen nobles shiver in their great halls despite roaring fires. I have watched peasants clustered together like bees in winter, sharing warmth that meant the difference between dawn and death. The land of Rus taught its people that survival was never guaranteed, that each sunset brought a trial, and that morning light was a gift earned through preparation, community, and sometimes sheer fortune. So let us step together into those long ago winters. let us discover how our ancestors transformed hostile darkness into something they could endure. For, in their strategies and rituals, in their layers and fires and whispered prayers, we find not merely history, but the eternal human struggle to carve out warmth in a cold world. The night awaits, my dear listener. Let us see how they faced it. Fire was the first defense, the primary weapon against the cold that pressed in from all directions. Yet fire in ancient Rus was not the reliable companion we know today, easily summoned with the flick of a switch. It was temperamental, demanding constant attention, and its effectiveness varied dramatically depending on where one slept and what resources one could command. In the peasant huts that dotted the landscape, wooden structures built of logs and sealed with daub or mud mixed with straw, fire took the form of an open hearth positioned at the center of the single main room. I recall entering such homes on bitter nights, immediately engulfed by smoke that stung the eyes and coated the throat. The smoke had nowhere to go but up through a hole in the roof, a crude arrangement that meant the entire dwelling remained perpetually hazed, the air thick and difficult to breathe. Yet there was method in this seeming chaos. The small size of these huts meant that a single fire could heat the entire space far more effectively than the grandest hearth in a stone castle. The wooden walls, though they allowed drafts, also retained warmth better than stone. The smoke itself, while unpleasant, had a curious benefit. It drove moisture from the timbers, preserving the structure and discouraging insects and rot. To live in such a place was to accept smoke as part of existence, as natural as breathing. The hearth's location at the room's center meant heat radiated in all directions. Families arranged their sleeping spaces around this focal point, with the youngest and oldest positioned closest to the flames. I have watched mothers carefully bank embers at night, covering them with a precise layer of ash to slow the burn while keeping the coals alive until morning. This was skilled work, passed from generation to generation. Too much ash, and the fire died, leaving the family to wake in a frozen chamber. Too little and precious fuel burned away before dawn. The wooden structures of peasant dwellings had another advantage, often overlooked. They breathed. Unlike stone, which absorbed cold and held it like a memory, wood insulated. The logs stacked horizontally and chinked with moss or clay created barriers that, while imperfect, slowed the cold's invasion. When snow fell thick around such a hut, it provided additional insulation, turning the dwelling into something resembling a burrow, protected by earth and snow and wood. Contrast this with the stone castles and chambers of the nobility. These fortresses, built to withstand siege and assault, became prisons of cold during winter months. Stone is a magnificent material for defense. Thick walls can absorb the impact of rams and resist fire, but it acts as what I might call a cold battery. During the day, weak, winter, sunlight might warm the exterior slightly, but this heat never penetrated deeply. At night, the stone released its stored cold inward, radiating chill into every chamber. Fireplaces in noble chambers were often large and ornate, their openings wide enough for a grown man to stand within. Fires roared in these hearths, consuming entire logs, even whole trees split and hauled inside by servants. The flames created spectacle, casting dramatic shadows and filling rooms with flickering orange light. Yet, for all this grandeur, they heated poorly. The wider the chimney, the more heat simply rose upward and vanished. The immediate vicinity of the fire might be comfortable, even uncomfortably warm. But step a dozen paces away, and your breath still misted in the air. I recall visiting the chambers of a Muscovite prince one January night when the cold had turned particularly vicious. His fireplace consumed more wood in a single evening than a peasant family might use in a week. Yet the chamber remained frigid. Tapestries hung on the walls fluttered with drafts that found their way through arrow slits and around window shutters. The stone floor felt like ice beneath one's boots. The prince sat directly before the fire, wrapped in furs, his face flushed with heat while his back remained cold. His servants huddled near the walls, stamping their feet and breathing into their hands. The management of fire required constant vigilance. Wood was not simply abundant, it had to be gathered, dried, split, and stored. Forests might be vast, but harvesting timber in winter was brutal work. Snow had to be cleared. Frozen would split with axes that rang like bells in the cold air, the pieces hauled back through drifts that could swallow a man to his waist. Noble estates maintained large woodpiles, carefully stacked and protected from snow. But even these stores could dwindle alarmingly during a particularly harsh season. Peasant families rationed their fuel carefully. A single log might be expected to burn through most of the night if banked properly. Children were taught from an early age the importance of never letting the fire die completely. For rekindling from scratch required precious resources, dry kindling, patience, and either flint and steel or embers borrowed from a neighbor. I have seen families share fire as they shared bread, carrying glowing coals in covered pots from one dwelling to another, an act of community that sustained entire villages. The hearth was more than a source of warmth. It was the center of domestic life, the place where food was prepared, where families gathered in the evening, where stories were told and prayers recited. To tend the fire was to maintain life itself. Women particularly carried this responsibility. Their knowledge of flame and ember, of wood types and burning rates, representing survival skills as important as any craft. Different woods burned differently. Birch, abundant in rust, caught easily and burned with a pleasant aroma, though it consumed quickly. Oak, harder to ignite, produced longer-lasting coals that could be banked through the night. Pine and other resinous woods burned hot, but filled chambers with thick smoke and dangerous sparks. The poorest families sometimes burned peat when wood grew scarce, digging it from bogs in summer and drying it for winter use. It smoldered slowly, providing minimal heat, but better than nothing. The fire's light was as important as its warmth. Winter nights in Russ stretched long, darkness falling in mid-afternoon and not lifting until late morning. Without fire, the night was absolute, a blackness that pressed against the eyes and filled the mind with fears, both rational and imagined. The hearth's glow pushed back this darkness, created a circle of safety, reminded the huddled family that they were not entirely at winter's mercy. Yet fire carried dangers. Sparks could ignite wooden structures in moments, and in a dwelling sealed against the cold, smoke could suffocate. I recall villages where fire watch was as important as any military guard, men and women taking turns throughout the night to ensure hearths burned safely, that sparks did not escape, that the smoke drew properly. A single, carelessly tended fire could destroy not just one family, but an entire community, as flames leaped from dwelling to dwelling with terrifying speed. In monasteries and churches, maintaining the fire took on spiritual significance. The eternal flame before icons was both literal and symbolic. A reminder that even in winter's darkest depths, faith endured. Monks tended these fires with the same devotion they brought to prayer, understanding that light and warmth were gifts from the divine, entrusted to human care. So the fire flickered and danced, fragile guardian against the cold. It demanded attention, consumed resources, filled lungs with smoke, and posed constant danger. Yet without it, survival was simply impossible. Each night, as families settled around their hearths, as nobles drew close to castle fireplaces, as monks whispered prayers before sacred flames, they engaged in the same ancient bargain. We feed you, we tend you, we breathe your smoke, and in return you keep us alive until dawn. The fire was life. To let it die was to surrender to winter's embrace. If fire was the first defense against the cold, fabric was the second, and perhaps the more reliable. For fire could falter, embers could die, but the layers one wrapped around one's body remained constant through the night, turning each person into their own small fortress of warmth. The bed itself was engineered with survival in mind, starting from the very foundation. Peasants slept on what they called pallets, simple sacks stuffed with straw or hay, spread either directly on the floor or atop crude wooden frames elevated a hand's breadth above the ground. This elevation, however slight, mattered enormously. Cold air sinks, gathering in the lowest spaces, and even lifting oneself a few inches made a tangible difference. I remember watching peasant families prepare these beds each autumn, carefully selecting the driest straw from the harvest, stuffing it tightly into coarse cloth sacks sewn from whatever fabric could be spared. The straw served multiple purposes. It provided cushioning against the hard floor or wooden planks. It insulated against the cold rising from below, and it created countless tiny air pockets that trapped body heat. Fresh straw smelled sweetly of late summer fields, a pleasant reminder of warmer days. As winter progressed and the straw compacted and aged, the smell grew earthier, more pungent, but no less comforting in its familiarity. For the nobility and wealthy merchants, feather beds represented the height of luxury. These were large cloth casings, stuffed with goose or duck down, the soft underlayer of feathers that birds use to insulate themselves. A well-made feather bed could be half a meter thick, creating a soft, yielding surface that molded to the body. Down is one of nature's finest insulators, trapping air in its structure and creating remarkable warmth relative to its weight. I have lain upon such beds, sinking into their embrace, feeling the downshift and settle around my form. The sensation was of floating, suspended in warmth. Noble families prized their feather beds so highly that these items appeared in wills and dowries, passed from generation to generation as treasured possessions. When lords traveled, their feather beds often traveled with them, carefully loaded onto carts, for the prospect of sleeping without this comfort was intolerable. Yet even the finest feather bed required protection from the cold below. Beds were built tall, sometimes raised several feet off the floor on sturdy wooden frames. This served multiple purposes. The elevation moved the sleeper away from the coldest air layer. It also created space beneath the bed that could be used for storage, keeping precious items safe and slightly warmer. And, psychologically, it placed one above the realm of mice and insects that scurried along the floor. The true engineering of medieval sleep revealed itself in the layers piled atop these mattresses. This was not simply a matter of throwing blankets onto a bed. It was a carefully considered system of insulation, with each layer serving a specific purpose. First came linen sheets, though these were far from universal. Linen was expensive, requiring cultivation of flax, a lengthy process of retting and processing the fibers, and skilled weaving. Wealthy households used linen sheets as a base layer, smooth against the skin and easier to wash than wool. But for most people, one simply laid directly upon the straw, tick, or feather mattress, separated from it only by one's sleeping clothes. Over the sleeper came wool. Thick woolen blankets formed the primary insulation. Wool has remarkable properties. Even when damp, it retains warmth. Its fibers trap air, creating countless tiny pockets of insulation, and it is remarkably durable, lasting years of constant use. These blankets were woven on home looms, heavy and coarse, often still carrying the lanolin from the sheep, which gave them a distinctive smell, earthy, slightly greasy, but not unpleasant to those accustomed to it. One blanket was never sufficient. 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 or 6 woolen blankets might be layered on a single bed. The weight of all this fabric became significant, pressing down on the sleeper like a heavy hand. I have known people who complained they could barely turn over once fully covered, so pinned were they by the sheer mass of wool. Yet this weight was welcomed, for it held the blankets close, prevented gaps where cold air might sneak in, and created a sense of security in the pressing darkness. Fur provided the final layer for those who could afford it. Pelts of fox, rabbit, squirrel, bear, or wolf were sewn together to create coverlets that represented wealth and status. But fur was not merely decorative. It provided insulation superior even to wool, especially when worn fur-side down, directly against the sleeper. The dense underfur trapped air close to the body, while the longer guard hairs created an outer barrier. In the coldest weather, people layered fur between woolen blankets, creating what we might call a textile sandwich. The theory, imperfect but not entirely wrong, was that fur trapped heat while wool above and below maintained it. The result was heavy, expensive, and gloriously warm. The four-poster bed, with its heavy curtains and canopy, represented the ultimate expression of medieval sleeping technology for those wealthy enough to afford it. These were not decorative items, but functional equipment essential for survival. The four posts, often carved from oak or other hardwood, rose from the corners of the bed to support a wooden frame overhead. From this frame hung heavy woolen curtains on all four sides, which could be drawn closed to completely enclose the sleeping space. When those curtains were pulled shut, magic happened. The enclosed space trapped the sleeper's body heat, warmed by breath and skin, preventing it from dissipating into the frigid chamber beyond. The temperature difference could be dramatic, perhaps only 5 or 6 degrees warmer inside than outside, but that difference meant everything. It transformed a sleeping space from merely tolerable to genuinely comfortable. I recall sleeping in such a bed during a journey through Novgorod one particularly bitter winter. The chamber was vast and cold, my breath visible in the air as I prepared for sleep. A servant helped me draw the bed curtains closed, and immediately the space felt different, smaller, more intimate, protected. As I lay beneath the wool and fur, the curtains created a microclimate, a tiny world separated from the hostile cold beyond. My breath warmed the air inside the enclosure. The fabric muffled sounds, creating a sense of isolation that, rather than frightening, felt secure. Of course, not everyone had access to four-poster beds. But the principle of creating an enclosed sleeping space was understood and replicated at all social levels. Peasant families sometimes hung cloth or hides from ceiling beams to create curtained areas around their sleeping spaces. In the coldest weather, entire families might crowd together inside such an enclosure, their combined body heat making the small space genuinely warm. The process of preparing for bed in medieval Rus was thus a layering ritual, both literal and metaphorical. One layered clothing, then covers, then enclosures, building barrier after barrier against the cold. Each layer might be insufficient alone, but together they created something approaching comfort. I have watched this ritual countless times, a mother checking that her children are properly covered, tucking wool around small bodies, ensuring no gaps exist where drafts might enter, a servant helping a noble lady into bed, arranging furs just so, smoothing wrinkles that might let cold air pool, a peasant man adding one more sheepskin to his family's pile, knowing that tonight the temperature will drop to depths that test even the most careful preparations. The sensory experience of these layered beds was distinctive, the weight pressing down, making movement difficult but creating security, the scratch of wool against skin, coarse but warming, the occasional prick of straw poking through the tick, the rustle of fabric with every small shift, the faint smell of lanolin and human scent of smoke that permeated everything, of the herbs sometimes scattered among the rushes on the floor, and gradually, imperceptibly, warmth built. Not the sudden warmth of standing before a fire, but a slow accumulation of heat trapped and held by layers of textile. The body relaxed, muscles unclenched. The mind, which had been focused on the cold, on the discomfort, began to drift toward sleep. This was survival through patience, through careful attention to detail, through the accumulated wisdom of generations. The bed was not merely a place to sleep, but a carefully engineered environment, a defensive structure built not of stone, but of straw and wool and fur, designed to create a pocket of life in the midst of killing cold. So they lay in their beds, nobles and peasants alike, wrapped in layers that represented not just material wealth, but human ingenuity and determination. Outside, the wind howled, snow fell, temperatures plummeted to depths where exposed skin would freeze in minutes. But inside these cocoons of fabric, life endured, maintained by nothing more than careful layering and the body's own warmth, preserved and amplified by textile barriers against the infinite cold. In the depths of those ancient winters, when cold pressed against every wall and seeped through every crack, the people of Rus discovered a truth both simple and profound. Warmth multiplied when bodies gathered together. To sleep alone in such conditions was to fight a losing battle. But to sleep in company, human or animal, was to transform desperate survival into something approaching comfort. The practice of communal sleeping was so widespread, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that the chroniclers rarely bothered to mention it. Yet evidence survives in property records, in architectural details, in casual asides, in letters and memoirs. I remember it well, for I walked through those winters and saw how people naturally gravitated together when darkness fell. In peasant households, the question of where to sleep scarcely existed. The entire family shared the main room of their dwelling, sleeping in a cluster around the central hearth. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents or unmarried relatives, all lay together on straw pallets or simple wooden platforms. The arrangements varied by family and season, but the principle remained constant, packed together tightly, share what warmth you have, and survive until morning. I recall entering such a home one particularly bitter night in the territory of Novgorod. The family consisted of a husband and wife, 4 children ranging from infant to adolescent, and the husband's elderly mother. Their dwelling was a single room, perhaps 4 meters by 5, with a hearth at the center and a sleeping platform built along one wall. As darkness fell and the cold intensified, they all climbed onto this platform together, arranging themselves like logs in a pile. The youngest child, barely a year old, was placed between his parents, his small body surrounded by their warmth. The grandmother lay on the outer edge, but tucked close against her grandchildren, while the oldest boy took the other outer position. Each person served as both warmer and warmed, giving heat to those beside them while receiving it in return. They covered themselves with a single large sheepskin and several woolen blankets, the edges tucked carefully to prevent any gaps. The phrase dormire acervitum appears in some Latin documents from this period, sleeping in a heap. It sounds crude to modern ears, yet it describes a necessity transformed into domestic art. These sleeping arrangements were carefully considered. The eldest and youngest, most vulnerable to cold, were positioned in the center of the group, where warmth concentrated. Those of middle years, who generated more heat, took the outer positions where their bodies created a protective wall against the cold air. In noble households, the situation was ostensibly different, yet the principle of shared warmth remained. A lord might not share his bed with all his household, but neither did he sleep entirely alone. Trusted servants often slept on pallets in the same chamber or in an adjacent room, their presence providing both security and warmth. The heat from several sleeping bodies raised the chamber's temperature, making the space more survivable. Ladies of rank frequently shared their beds with female companions or servants. This arrangement provided warmth, certainly, but also accompanied through the long dark hours, protection against fears both real and imagined, and assistance should anything be needed during the night. I have known noble women who maintained that they could not sleep without another person present, not from fear, but simply because the shared warmth had become so essential that sleeping alone felt impossibly cold. The practice extended beyond immediate family and servants. In monasteries, monks slept in dormitories, their cots or pallets arranged in long rows, side by side. The communal warmth of 30 or 40 men in a single space made these dormitories notably warmer than individual cells would have been. Soldiers in garrison kept similar arrangements, bunking together in groups that maximized warmth while minimizing the space that needed to be heated. Travelers faced perhaps the greatest challenge, finding themselves in unfamiliar places without their usual sleeping arrangements. Inns addressed this by offering communal sleeping platforms where guests lay side by side, often sharing blankets with complete strangers. I have slept in such places myself, pressed between a merchant smelling of leather and wool and a pilgrim who snored with impressive volume. The intimacy was unavoidable and initially uncomfortable, but as the night deepened and cold intensified, one became grateful for the warmth of these unknown bodies. But human warmth alone was sometimes insufficient, and so the people of Rus did something that might seem strange to modern sensibilities. They invited animals into their sleeping spaces. In the countryside, peasant dwellings were often designed with an area for livestock integrated into the structure. The family lived in one section, while cows, goats, pigs, or chickens occupied another. sometimes separated by only a low partition, or even just by custom, rather than any physical barrier. The animal's body heat warmed the entire structure. A single cow, with its large body and constant heat production, could raise the temperature of a small dwelling by several precious degrees. On the coldest nights, the separation between human and animal spaces became even less distinct. Chickens might be brought inside in baskets to prevent them from freezing. Goats might be allowed to wander freely. I have seen families deliberately position their sleeping pallets against the wall that separated them from their livestock, knowing that the warmth from the animals would seep through. Dogs, however, were the most common sleeping companions. These were not the pampered pets of later eras, but working animals, guardians, hunters, companions. Yet they served another crucial function. They were living heaters. A large dog radiates surprising warmth, and their thick fur coats mean they remain comfortable at temperatures that would chill humans. The practice of sleeping with dogs occurred at all social levels. Peasant families welcomed their hounds onto sleeping platforms where the animals curled at feet or nestled between children. Noble ladies kept small lapdogs that slept beneath the covers, pressed against their mistresses' bodies. Hunting dogs, valued for their skills, were sometimes brought into noble chambers on the coldest nights, their presence tolerated for the warmth they provided. I recall one particularly affluent merchant in Skov who kept 3 large dogs specifically for sleeping purposes. These animals, well fed and brushed, had no duties other than to warm their master's bed. He claimed, with only slight exaggeration, that with his 3 dogs he needed half the blankets of his neighbors. The phrase "three-dog night" may come from later folklore, but the concept was well understood in medieval Rus. The number of dogs one needed in bed correlated directly with the severity of the cold. The sensory experience of such sleeping arrangements was intense and undeniable. The smell of unwashed bodies of dogs who had been rolling in snow and mud, of straw and wool and smoke, all of it combined into an aroma that was simply the smell of home, of survival, of winter. The sounds, too, were distinctive. The breathing of multiple sleepers, the snores and sighs, the soft whimpers of dreaming children, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of straw as someone shifted position. There was a rhythm to these shared sleeps. Early in the night, people might talk quietly, sharing news or stories, discussing the next day's tasks. Children giggled until exhaustion or parental discipline silenced them. Gradually, the sounds faded as sleep claimed one person after another. The collective breathing became a kind of music, a reminder that one was not alone in the darkness, that warmth and life persisted despite the cold pressing against the walls. Of course, such arrangements had their drawbacks. Privacy was non-existent. Illness spread easily when people slept so close together. Lice and fleas found easy passage from one body to another. Personal space was a concept that simply did not exist. Arguments could not be escaped, and tensions had nowhere to dissipate. Yet, set against these inconveniences was the simple, overwhelming fact of survival. A family sleeping apart in individual spaces would have required multiple fires, vastly more fuel, and would still have been colder. The child who might have frozen, sleeping alone, survived when nestled between siblings. The elderly grandmother, whose body no longer generated sufficient heat, made it through the night because of the warmth radiating from her grandchildren. This practice of communal warmth reflected a deeper truth about life in medieval Rus. Survival was not an individual accomplishment, but a collective one. The family, the household, the community itself functioned as a single organism, with each member contributing to the survival of all. To share one's body heat was not charity, but reciprocity, knowing that tonight you warmed your neighbor, and tomorrow night your neighbor would warm you. I have witnessed great acts of courage in my long years, warriors facing impossible odds, leaders making choices that determined the fates of nations. But there is a quiet courage, too, in the parent who rises in the coldest part of the night to check that blankets still cover sleeping children, who sacrifices the warmest position to ensure the most vulnerable are protected. In the strangers who accept lying next to each other in an inn, swallowing pride and discomfort to share what warmth they have. In the family that welcomes even their dogs and goats into the sleeping space, recognizing that all breathing creatures possess warmth that can be shared. So they slept, piled together like cubs in a den, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, their bodies pressed close, finding in proximity what individual effort could never achieve. Outside, winter raged. Inside, warmth accumulated, not the blazing heat of a great fire, but the gentle, persistent warmth of life, recognizing life, of bodies refusing to surrender to the cold, of humanity adapting, enduring, and surviving through the simple act of staying close. As darkness descended and the time for sleep approached, the people of ancient Rus engaged in a ritual that might seem peculiar to our modern sensibilities. They dressed for bed, but unlike our contemporary practice of changing into specialized sleepwear, they often added layers, transforming themselves into bundled figures barely recognizable beneath their wrappings. The concept of pajamas, lightweight garments designed specifically for sleeping, would have seemed absurd in a land where nights could kill. Instead, sleeping attire was chosen for a single purpose: to trap and preserve body heat through hours when the fire burned low and cold infiltrated even the most carefully sealed chamber. For the common folk, the question of what to wear to bed was simple: everything. The same rough wool tunic and linen undershift worn during the day remained on the body at night. Perhaps the outermost, dirtiest layers might be removed, a mud-caked over-tunic, sodden boots, but beneath this, clothing stayed in place. The linen shift, worn next to the skin, provided a base layer. Over this, the wool tunic added insulation. In extreme cold, even outer garments might be piled on top as extra blankets. I remember watching a peasant family prepare for sleep one January evening when the cold had turned particularly vicious. The father simply lay down in his day clothes, pulling a sheepskin over himself. The mother checked each child, ensuring their wool tunics were smoothed down without wrinkles that might create cold spots, that sleeves covered wrists and hems reached ankles. The youngest, barely 3 years old, was so bundled in layers of wool that he could barely move his arms. He looked less like a child than a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. But when his mother tucked him between his siblings, he was warm. The nobility had more options, though they too understood that warmth trumped elegance once darkness fell. Wealthier households possessed specialized sleeping garments, long linen nightshirts that reached to the ankles, sometimes embroidered at the collar and cuffs, made of finer weaves than the rough cloth available to peasants. These nightshirts were voluminous, designed to be worn over one's underclothes rather than replacing them. I recall visiting a Bojar's household in Moscow during the heart of winter. The lady of the house prepared for bed by first layering 2 linen shifts, one atop the other. Over these went a wool undertunic, then a long sleeping gown of heavy linen. Her servant brought a bed jacket, a short, quilted garment designed to cover the shoulders and upper body with extra warmth. Only after all these layers were in place did she finally climb into her bed, where additional furs and blankets awaited. But perhaps the most universal element of sleeping attire, worn by rich and poor alike, was the nightcap. These cloth coverings for the head appeared in every household, from the humblest peasant hut to the grandest chambers. The reasoning was sound. The human body loses significant heat through the scalp, and covering the head prevented this heat from escaping into the cold night air. Nightcaps took various forms. Peasants wore simple cloth squares tied under the chin, or hoods that covered head and ears. Wealthier individuals had caps sewn to fit the head, sometimes lined with fur for additional warmth, occasionally with long tails that could be wrapped around the neck. Some religious orders prescribed specific head coverings for sleep, considering it improper to lie down with the head bare. I have countless memories of medieval bedrooms filled with figures wearing these caps, their heads wrapped in cloth even as they lay beneath heavy covers. It created a peculiar sight, faces peeking out from beneath layers of textile, only eyes and noses visible, looking more like swaddled infants than grown adults. But there was wisdom in the practice. The cap trapped heat that would otherwise have radiated away, and it protected the ears, which were particularly vulnerable to frostbite even indoors. Foot coverings represented another crucial element. Bare feet on a cold floor, or even against cold sheets, risked genuine injury. Wealthy households had thick wool stockings or socks worn to bed. Peasants might wrap their feet in strips of wool or linen, creating makeshift insulation. Some people kept their day boots nearby, prepared to slip feet into them if they needed to rise during the night. For the floor could be cold enough to cause pain in mere moments. There existed a folk practice, recorded in various household manuals and mentioned in letters, of rubbing the feet with oil or fat before bed, then covering them with cloth. The layer of oil was thought to seal in warmth, though it also served the practical purpose of softening skin cracked and damaged by cold. I have seen mothers carefully tend to their children's feet each night, working warmed oil into the skin before wrapping them snugly. Gloves or mittens in bed were less common, but not unknown. Those suffering from poor circulation or joint pain might sleep with hands covered, especially in the deepest cold. Some manuscripts even illustrate sleepers with hands wrapped, looking as though prepared for a journey rather than for rest. The process of dressing for bed thus became a layering ceremony, each item added serving a specific purpose. The linen next to the skin wicked away moisture from the body. The wool over this trapped air and provided insulation. Outer layers added additional barriers against the cold. The cap preserved heat at the head. Foot wrappings protected the extremities. Each layer represented accumulated wisdom about how to survive the night. But clothing served purposes beyond mere warmth. In an age when communal sleeping was common, when servants might share chambers with their masters, when travelers bedded down among strangers, sleeping clothed maintained modesty and propriety. To sleep naked or near naked was considered inappropriate, even scandalous in some contexts. Clothing created a barrier, a small assertion of dignity and privacy in spaces where physical privacy barely existed. There were also spiritual considerations. The body in sleep was considered vulnerable to evil influences. to demons and spirits that wandered the night. Proper clothing was thought to offer protection, a physical manifestation of readiness and vigilance even in slumber. Some religious traditions taught that to sleep completely exposed was to invite spiritual danger, that cloth itself held protective properties when blessed or worn with pious intent. I recall a conversation with a village priest near Scouve, who explained that he instructed his congregation to sleep clothed as a form of spiritual discipline. The soul must never fully abandon its guard, he told me, his breath misting in the cold chapel air. Even in sleep, we must be prepared for the Lord's call, and clothing represents our readiness to rise and serve. Whether this teaching was rooted in theology or simply pragmatic acknowledgement that staying clothed meant staying warmer, I cannot say. Perhaps it was both. The sensory experience of sleeping in such layers was distinctive. The cloth pressed against skin, creating warmth through contact and friction. The various layers rustled with every movement, making even small shifts audible in the quiet night. Wool scratched faintly, its coarse texture a constant reminder of its presence. Linen felt smoother, but grew damp from the body's moisture, requiring careful management to prevent this dampness from becoming a source of chill. The weight of the clothing, combined with the weight of the blankets above, created a cocoon-like sensation. Movement became difficult, almost laborious. To turn over required coordinated effort, gathering layers, shifting bulk, resettling. Some people found this constriction comforting, the pressure and tightness providing a sense of security. Others found it maddening, feeling trapped and confined. Children particularly struggled with these layers. I have watched little ones whimper and fuss as their mothers wrapped them for sleep, their small arms pinned by wool, their faces barely visible beneath caps tied tight. Yet, within minutes of being settled among their siblings, their complaints ceased. The warmth worked its magic, and they slept soundly, their breath steady and peaceful, despite being bundled so tightly they could barely move. There existed a curious tension between the desire for warmth and the need for some freedom of movement. Too many layers, and one could barely breathe, felt suffocated beneath the weight of fabric. Too few, and the cold crept in. Finding the balance required attention and adjustment. Throughout the night, sleepers might shed or add layers as their body temperature fluctuated, as the fire's warmth waxed or waned, as midnight's deepest cold gave way to the slightly warmer hours before dawn. Wealthier individuals sometimes had servants specifically tasked with monitoring their masters through the night, ensuring that coverings remained in place, that the sleeper had neither too many nor too few layers. These servants slept in the same chamber or just outside, rising periodically to check the fire and adjust bedding as needed. It was exhausting work, breaking one's own sleep to ensure another's comfort, yet it was considered essential service. The practice of sleeping clothed had practical consequences beyond warmth. Garments worn all day and all night required more frequent washing and repair. Yet washing in winter was a challenge in itself. How does one dry heavy wool or linen when the air itself is frozen? Households developed rhythms around this necessity, washing clothes during brief, warm spells when sun might dry them, or hanging them near the fire where they steamed and filled chambers with the smell of damp wool. Lice and fleas thrived in this environment of constant clothing and communal sleeping. These pests were accepted as inevitable companions, fought against, but never fully defeated. People developed elaborate rituals around pest management, regular inspection of seams where lice laid eggs, combing hair with fine-toothed bone combs, sprinkling crushed herbs among the layers of clothing to repel insects. Yet still the pests persisted, another discomfort added to the general burden of winter survival. Some folk practices bordered on superstition, but were nonetheless faithfully observed. In certain regions, it was believed that sleeping with your clothes inside out would prevent nightmares and ward off evil spirits. Children might be dressed in their father's tunic or mother's shawl for protection. The scent and essence of the parent thought to guard the child through the vulnerable hours of sleep. Warriors sometimes slept in their padded underarmor, the quilted garments providing both warmth and a sense of continued vigilance. The contrast between noble and peasant sleeping attire was less stark than one might imagine. Yes, the nobleman's linen was finer, his wool softer and better woven, his garments more numerous and varied. But both noble and peasant understood the same fundamental principle. At night, when fire burned low and cold pressed close, survival depended not on elegance, but on layers untrapping every possible bit of warmth against the skin and holding it there until morning. I have slept in both hovels and halls during those long-ago winters, and I can attest that the sensation of lying bundled in layers, wrapped like a gift, covered with blankets and furs, was remarkably similar, regardless of the quality of the materials. The slight claustrophobia, the warmth gradually building, the rustle of fabric with each breath, the pressure of weight holding one down. These experiences transcended social class. In the depths of the night, when cold was most intense and fires burned lowest, when darkness pressed against shuttered windows and wind howled around corners, the people of Rus lay swaddled in their lairs. They looked perhaps comical to modern eyes, these bundled, cloth-wrapped figures barely visible beneath their coverings. But there was nothing comical about the purpose they served. Each layer represented a barrier against death, each wrapping a refusal to surrender to winter's killing embrace. The morning brought its own ritual. Emerging from these cocoons required courage. The air outside the blankets was shockingly cold, making the warm nest beneath the covers seem even more precious. People lingered, delaying the moment when they must cast off covers and face the day. Children had to be coaxed or commanded to rise, their reluctance entirely understandable. Yet rise they did, shedding some layers, adjusting others, preparing to face another day in the endless winter. The same garments that had kept them alive through the night would serve them through the day. A continuous cycle of protection that only truly ended with the arrival of spring. So remember this. When we imagine medieval sleep, we must picture not the peaceful, lightly clad sleepers of Renaissance paintings, but people wrapped in layers upon layers, their bodies transformed into walking bundles of cloth, their faces barely visible beneath caps and hoods. They were not comfortable by our standards, but they were warm enough to survive, and in the depths of a Rus winter, survival was its own form of comfort. The bed was prepared with its layers of straw and wool and fur. The body was clothed in its protective wrappings. The fire burned in its hearth. Yet the people of ancient Rus possessed one more weapon against the cold, a technique so simple and yet so effective that it was employed from the humblest cottage to the grandest chamber: the warming stone. The principle was ancient, perhaps as old as fire itself. Stone, when heated, holds warmth far longer than other materials. A flat stone placed in the coals of a fire until it glowed with heat could then be wrapped in cloth and tucked into the bed, where it would radiate warmth for hours. This warmth targeted the areas most vulnerable to cold, the feet, which suffered first when temperatures dropped, and the core of the body. I have countless memories of watching this ritual performed. In a peasant household, the mother of the family would select flat stones earlier in the day, placing them carefully in the ashes at the edge of the hearth, where they could heat slowly without cracking from sudden temperature change. As evening approached and the family prepared for sleep, she would use wooden tongs or a wrapped cloth to retrieve these stones, now almost too hot to approach. The stones had to be wrapped carefully. Direct contact with skin would cause burns, yet the wrapping could not be so thick that it blocked the warmth entirely. Coarse wool or heavy linen served this purpose well. The stone would be placed at the center of a cloth. Then the corners gathered and tied, creating a bundle that could be handled and positioned safely. These hot stones found their way to the foot of the bed, where they transformed the cold, hostile space into something approaching comfort. The first touch of feet to a bed warmed by hot stones was a small miracle, a moment of genuine pleasure in the midst of winter's harshness. The warmth spread upward from the feet, relaxing muscles tensed against the cold, allowing the body to ease into sleep rather than fighting through shivering discomfort. In wealthier households, this practice was refined into something approaching luxury. Multiple stones might be prepared, placed at strategic locations throughout the bed. Servants were tasked with heating the stones at precise times, ensuring they reached optimal temperature just as the master or mistress prepared to retire. I recall visiting a merchant's house in Novgorod, where the wife insisted on having 4 heated stones every night at the foot of the bed, one at each side where her hands might rest. She claimed that without this preparation, she could not sleep at all, that the cold would simply keep her awake until dawn. The nobility, ever seeking ways to differentiate themselves from common folk, developed specialized implements for this purpose. Metal warming pans appeared in some households, long-handled copper or brass vessels with perforated lids designed to hold hot coals. A servant would fill such a pan with embers from the fire, then slide it between the bed sheets, moving it back and forth to distribute warmth evenly across the surface. I have watched this process performed with almost ceremonial precision. The servant would arrive with the warming pan, its brass surface gleaming in the firelight, smoke wisping from the small holes in its lid. The bed curtains would be drawn back, and the pan inserted between the layers of bedding. The servant would slide it slowly from one side to the other, allowing the heat to permeate the linens, then withdraw it just before the master or mistress climbed into bed. The result was remarkable. Sheets that moments before had felt like ice now radiated gentle warmth. The dampness that accumulated in fabric during cold days evaporated, leaving the bed dry and inviting. For a few precious moments, the bed felt almost tropical, a pocket of summer warmth in the depths of winter. But warming pans carried risks. Too much heat for too long could scorch fabric, leaving brown marks or even setting fire to the bedding. Stories circulated of careless servants who left pans in place too long, of nobles who awoke to find holes burned through expensive linens, or worse, of fires that spread from a forgotten warming pan to consume entire chambers. Vigilance was essential. Beyond stones and pans, other warming aids were employed. Bags filled with hot sand served a similar purpose to stones, but molded more comfortably to the body's contours. Sand retained heat nearly as well as stone, and posed less risk of burns through the wrapping. Some households kept special pouches made of leather or heavy cloth specifically for this purpose, filling them with sand heated in the fire, then placed at the foot of the bed or tucked against the sleeper's side. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth were another variation, particularly common in areas where suitable flat stones were not readily available. Bricks had the advantage of uniform shape, making them easier to position precisely. A well-heated brick could remain warm through the entire night, providing continuous comfort rather than gradually cooling like smaller stones. In some regions, people employed heated grain, barley, or wheat, placed in cloth bags and warmed near the fire. The grain held heat remarkably well and had the added benefit of a pleasant, faintly toasted smell. Children particularly favored these grain-filled warmers, hugging them close like companions through the night. The timing of these warming preparations was crucial. Stones or pans introduced too early would cool before sleep, wasting their warmth. Applied too late, and one might lie shivering while waiting for the bed to warm. Experienced households developed precise rhythms, knowing exactly when to begin heating the stones, when to insert the warming pan, when to call the family to bed so they might slide between the sheets at the moment of optimal warmth. But even the most carefully heated bed could not maintain its warmth indefinitely. As the night deepened and the stones gradually cooled, the warmth faded. In the coldest hours before dawn, when fires had burned to embers and the outside temperature reached its lowest point, the stones offered only memory of warmth rather than warmth itself. Yet even this was valuable. The initial warmth had allowed sleep to come, and once deeply asleep, the body was less aware of the gradual cooling. Some people, particularly the elderly or those with illnesses, required stones to be refreshed during the night. This meant someone, usually a servant or family member, had to rise in the darkest hours, retrieve the cooled stones, replace them with newly heated ones. It was sacrificial work, leaving one's own warm bed to tend to another's needs. But in caring households, it was done without complaint. I remember an elderly grandmother in a village near Skove, her hands gnarled with age and stiffened by cold. Her grandson, perhaps 12 years old, had taken upon himself the task of refreshing her warming stones each night. I watched him rise in the middle of the night, carefully extracting the cooled stones from his grandmother's bed while she slept, placing them back in the fire to heat. Then, after a time, retrieving them and returning them to her bed, all without waking her. His own sleep was fragmented by this duty, yet he performed it with quiet devotion, understanding that his grandmother's survival depended on this warmth. The practice of using hot stones and warming pans created a sensory landscape unique to medieval winters. The smell of heated stone and fabric, slightly scorched but not unpleasant. The gentle, radiant warmth against the soles of the feet, spreading slowly upward. The satisfaction of sliding into a pre-warmed bed. The immediate relaxation that came with heat rather than the tense endurance of cold. These sensations were as much a part of medieval life as the taste of bread or the sight of snow. There were folk beliefs attached to these practices as well. Some people insisted that stones, heated on a particular holy day, held their warmth longer, as though blessed by the occasion. Others believed that stones taken from specific locations, riverbeds, ancient ruins, sacred sites, carried special properties. Whether these beliefs had any basis in fact mattered less than the psychological comfort they provided. the sense that one was employing not just practical techniques, but sacred wisdom passed down through generations. In monasteries, the practice of using warming stones was sometimes viewed with suspicion by stricter religious orders, who saw comfort as a potential path to spiritual weakness. Yet even the most austere monks recognized that freezing to death served no holy purpose. Warming stones appeared in monastic cells, though perhaps with less ceremony and abundance than in noble chambers. The stones were seen as medical necessity rather than luxury, permitted for the elderly and infirm, tolerated for the general brotherhood during the cruelest weather. The democratizing effect of warming stones should not be overlooked. This was a technology available to all social classes. The poorest peasant could select a stone from a field and heat it in their fire. The wealthiest noble might have purpose-made warming pans of imported brass, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Heat stone, wrap it, place it in bed. Survival techniques in Rus often crossed social boundaries in this way, for winter did not discriminate, and cold affected beggar and bojar alike. As spring finally approached and temperatures began their slow climb toward tolerable, the warming stones were gradually retired. First, one might need only a single stone rather than multiple ones, then perhaps only on the very coldest nights. Eventually, the stones could remain in the hearth, no longer needed for sleep. This transition was welcomed, for it meant winter's grip was finally loosening. The sight of warming stones sitting unused became a small symbol of hope, a promise that warmth would soon come from the sun itself, rather than having to be captured and carried to bed each night. So remember these stones, these humble pieces of heated rock wrapped in cloth. They were not grand or elegant. They required effort and attention. They cooled eventually, their warmth temporary. But for the people of ancient Rus, they represented a crucial strategy in the nightly battle against cold. That moment of sliding feet toward a warm stone in the darkness, of feeling heat seep into frozen toes, of knowing that at least for now, at least in this small space, winter had been held at bay. That moment was a victory, small but genuine, in the endless struggle to survive until spring. If you were to ask the people of ancient Rus how they slept through the long winter nights, they might look at you with puzzlement, for the question would seem to assume something false, that sleep came in a single, unbroken stretch from dark to dawn. But this was not their experience. Their nights were divided, segmented, punctuated by a period of wakefulness that was not considered disruption, but rather natural rhythm. The pattern was so universal, so deeply ingrained in daily life, that it scarcely merited comment in chronicles or letters. Yet evidence of it appears in scattered references in the organization of monastic hours, in casual mentions of activities conducted between sleeps. Modern scholars have given it a name, biphasic or segmented sleep. But to medieval people, it was simply how nights unfolded. Darkness fell early in winter, sometimes as early as 4 or 5 in the afternoon in the northern regions of Rus. The sun, which had risen late and traveled a low arc across the southern sky, would sink below the horizon while the day's work was far from finished. Yet, without artificial light beyond the fire, and perhaps a precious candle or two, productive work became difficult once true darkness descended. And so, a few hours after sunset, perhaps around 8 or 9 in the evening, people went to bed. This was not the result of exhaustion so much as practicality. Why remain awake in cold darkness, consuming fuel for light and heat, when one could retreat to bed, where layers of wool and fur would trap body warmth. The first sleep came easily, aided by physical tiredness from the day's labor, by full bellies if food had been adequate, by the simple comfort of lying down after hours on one's feet. This first sleep was deep and restorative. I have lain beside sleeping families during these hours and observed how completely they surrendered to slumber. The children became utterly still, their breathing slow and regular. Even the adults, usually alert to every sound in their dangerous world, fell into profound rest. This was the sleep the body craved most desperately, the deep unconsciousness that knit together the day's damage and prepared the organism for the trials ahead. But then, sometime around midnight or in the hours just after, they woke, not with a start, not with alarm, but with a gradual return to consciousness that felt entirely natural. One person would stir, then another, and soon the household was quietly awake, lying in darkness or near darkness, the fire reduced to glowing embers, the world outside silent beneath its blanket of snow. This period of wakefulness was called by various names. In Latin texts, it appears as first watch or vigilia in common speech. It might simply be the watching or the waking time. It lasted an hour, sometimes two, occasionally longer, in the depths of winter, when nights stretched endlessly and sleep came less easily to cold bodies. What did people do during this mysterious interval between first and second sleep? The activities varied by household and circumstance, but certain patterns emerged consistently across the land. Most immediately and practically, someone rose to tend the fire. By midnight, even a well-banked fire had burned low, and the chamber's warmth had dissipated considerably. The first waking person, often the head of household or a designated servant, would slip from beneath the covers, feel the shock of cold air against face and hands, and shuffle to the hearth. They would poke at the embers, coaxing them back to life, add small pieces of kindling, then larger would once flames caught. The fire's revival was both practical necessity and psychological comfort, its renewed light pushing back the darkness that had grown thick and oppressive. I recall countless nights when I witnessed this ritual. The quiet rustle as someone emerged from bed, the soft padding of feet across the floor, the faint shower of sparks as a stick stirred the embers, the small flames catching, growing, beginning to illuminate the chamber once more, and gradually warmth beginning to build again, seeping outward from the renewed fire. While one person tended the fire, others might lie quietly, not quite ready to fully wake, but no longer deeply asleep. This was considered a sacred time for prayer and reflection. The darkness, the silence, the sense of existing in a liminal space between one day and the next, all of this lent itself to spiritual contemplation. In monasteries, this midnight waking was formalized into the office of matins. Bells would ring through the cold night air, calling the brothers to prayer. They would rise from their dormitory beds, wrap cloaks around themselves, and file into the chapel, where their breath formed clouds, and their voices joined in psalms and hymns. The prayers were long, sometimes lasting an hour or more, acknowledging the vulnerable darkness and asking for protection until dawn. But even in secular households, prayer during the watching time was common. People might recite paternos, ters, or Ave Marias, their voices barely above whispers, so as not to wake children who had drifted back to sleep. Some households kept prayer books or psalters specifically for this purpose, though in the darkness, Most prayers were recited from memory, words learned in childhood and repeated countless times. There existed special prayers composed for this particular hour. I remember one that began, "In this dark watch between the sleeps, O Lord, guard us from evil that walks the night." These prayers acknowledged both physical and spiritual dangers, the cold that might claim the unwary, the demons and spirits believed to be most active in the deepest night, the uncertainty that darkness always brought. But the watching time was not solely devoted to spiritual matters. This quiet hour offered opportunities unavailable during the bustle of day or the deep unconsciousness of first sleep. Married couples might talk quietly, discussing matters too private or complex for daytime conversation. When children and servants were always nearby, plans were made, concerns shared, intimacy enjoyed. Some medical texts of the period even suggested that this interval was the ideal time for marital relations, the body being rested but not yet fallen back into deep slumber. Parents checked on their children during the watching time, adjusting blankets that had been kicked off, ensuring that warming stones still radiated sufficient heat, listening for the steady breathing that indicated health and safety. In larger households, masters might check on servants, not from mistrust, but from the same concern that motivated parents, the need to ensure that all under their roof survived until morning. The watching time also served practical purposes beyond tending the fire. People might relieve themselves, using chamber pots kept near the bed for precisely this reason, for the prospect of venturing outside in the middle of a winter night was unthinkable. They might eat a small snack if hunger woke them, a piece of bread saved from supper, a drink of watered ale. Nursing mothers fed infants during this time, the quiet darkness providing a peaceful setting for this intimate act. Some people used the watching time for quiet work. Women might mend by the light of the revived fire, their needles flashing as they repaired the endless tears and worn spots in the household's garments. Men might work on small projects, carving, whittling, repairing tools. Monks copied manuscripts during these hours, the silence of the night conducive to the careful attention required for transcription. In some households, storytelling occurred during the watching time. Grandparents or elders would recount tales to whoever remained awake, their voices soft in the darkness. These were often stories suited to the mysterious hour, tales of spirits and wonders, of historical events, of family history and legend. I have listened to many such stories over the centuries, whispered in the darkness while embers glowed and snow fell silently outside. There was a particular quality to these midnight hours, a sense of existing outside normal time. The day had ended, but the new day had not truly begun. It was an in-between time, liminal and somehow magical. People spoke of thoughts coming more clearly during the watching, of problems that had seemed insurmountable during the day revealing their solutions in the quiet darkness. The watching time also served as a survival mechanism in ways beyond the obvious need to tend the fire. By waking naturally at midnight, people could assess the situation. Was anyone showing signs of dangerous cold? Did children still breathe steadily? Had the fire died completely, requiring urgent attention? This periodic check allowed problems to be caught and addressed before they became fatal. In peasant households, the watching time sometimes included checking on animals. A conscientious farmer might slip outside briefly to ensure his livestock had survived the night so far, that snow had not collapsed a shelter, that the cow was not showing signs of distress. These checks were quick, mere minutes in the brutal cold, but they could mean the difference between finding a problem in time to fix it and waking to disaster at dawn. For travelers sleeping in unfamiliar inns or monasteries, the watching time offered opportunity to assess their situation and ensure their safety. One might check that possessions remained secure, that the fire had not died completely, that fellow travelers posed no threat. In an age when travel was dangerous and strangers were viewed with suspicion, this midnight vigilance was prudent. The transition from waking back to second sleep was gradual. As the fire burned steady, as prayers were completed, as conversations wound down, people would one by one slip back beneath their covers. The chamber, now slightly warmer than it had been at midnight, welcomed them back. Bodies still carried warmth from the first sleep, and covers that had been pushed aside were drawn close once more. The second sleep was different from the first. It tended to be lighter, more prone to dreams, easier to wake from. Perhaps this was because the body had already received its deepest rest during the first sleep. Perhaps it was simply that dawn approached and the unconscious mind prepared for waking. Whatever the reason, the second sleep carried a different quality, still restorative, but gentler, less profound. Dreams seemed more vivid during second sleep. People reported elaborate dream narratives, symbolic visions, nightmares that woke them with racing hearts. Some believed that dreams during this period were more meaningful, more likely to contain messages from the divine or warnings about the future. Dream interpretation often focused specifically on visions experienced during the hours between the watching time and dawn. The duration of second sleep varied by season and individual. In the depths of winter, when dawn came late, second sleep might last 4 or 5 hours. As spring approached and mornings brightened earlier, this period shortened naturally. Some people, particularly the elderly or those with illness, might not achieve second sleep at all, instead lying awake through the remaining hours until dawn, perhaps dozing occasionally, but never fully surrendering to slumber. Children often fell back asleep more readily than adults, their young bodies demanding more total rest. Parents would listen to their children's breathing deepen and slow, taking comfort in these sounds of health and safety. The knowledge that one's children slept peacefully was itself a kind of warmth, easing parental hearts even as cold pressed against the walls. The final waking, the true dawn rising, came gradually as the faintest gray light began to seep through shutters or around door frames, as roosters crowed if they had survived the cold, as the household stirred with the day's demands. The second sleep released its hold. People emerged from their cocoons of wool and fur with reluctance, knowing that the day's hardships awaited, but unable to postpone them any longer. This pattern of segmented sleep shaped the rhythm of life in ways both obvious and subtle. The night was not simply a void between days, but had its own structure, its own activities and meaning. Time between the sleeps was productive time, social time, spiritual time. It was when marriages were strengthened through quiet conversation, when prayers most earnest were offered, when fires were maintained and disasters averted. Modern people, accustomed to a single consolidated block of sleep, sometimes struggle when they wake in the middle of the night, viewing it as insomnia or disorder. But for the people of ancient Rus, such waking was entirely normal. They did not fight it or feel anxious about it. They simply accepted it as the natural way of things, used the time productively, and then returned to sleep when ready. There was wisdom in this pattern. The segmented sleep allowed for flexibility, for response to changing conditions. If the fire had died, it could be revived before the cold became dangerous. If a child grew ill, signs could be noticed and addressed. If thieves or wild animals approached, the likelihood that someone was awake to hear them increased. The segmented sleep was thus both practical survival strategy and deeply human rhythm. I have slept the segmented sleep myself through many centuries, in many lands, but nowhere did it seem more natural and necessary than in the winter nights of ancient Rus. The cold demanded vigilance, and the segmented sleep provided it. The long darkness required breaking into manageable portions, and the watching time accomplished this. The human need for both rest and awareness found balance in this ancient pattern. So picture a household in deepest winter, the first sleep beginning shortly after sunset, deep and restorative. Then the natural waking around midnight, the quiet stirring, the fire tended, prayers whispered, conversations murmured. Then the gradual return to second sleep, lighter but still restful, carrying the household through to dawn. This was the rhythm of winter nights, as predictable as the seasons themselves, as necessary as bread and water. When spring finally arrived and nights grew shorter, the pattern shifted naturally. First and second sleep grew closer together until they merged into something approaching modern consolidated sleep. But even then, the tendency to wake briefly around midnight often persisted, a vestige of winter's demands carrying through into gentler seasons. The segmented sleep was not unique to Rus. It appeared across medieval Europe and indeed in many pre-industrial societies. But in the particular conditions of Rus winters, with their brutal cold and endless darkness, this sleep pattern became not merely custom, but crucial survival mechanism. It was one more adaptation in the complex web of strategies that allowed human life to persist in a land that seemed determined to extinguish it. To sleep was to become vulnerable. The conscious mind that guided one through the day's dangers retreated, leaving the body unguarded against threats, both physical and spiritual. And so the people of ancient Rus surrounded their sleeping spaces with protections, some rooted in practical wisdom, others in beliefs about unseen forces that prowled the darkness. The bed itself was often circled with defensive measures. Iron objects were particularly favored for their supposed power to repel malevolent spirits. A knife might be slipped beneath the pillow or mattress, its blade pointing outward, believed to create a barrier that demons and evil spirits could not cross. Keys, horseshoes, or simple iron nails might be hung from the bed frame or tucked into crevices in the wall nearby. I recall visiting a prosperous farmer's household near Smolensk, where the bed frame had small iron crosses hammered into each post, and an iron horseshoe hung above the headboard. When I asked about this, the farmer's wife explained matter-of-factly, "Iron keeps away that which would harm us in the dark." My grandmother taught me this, and her grandmother before her. We have never had trouble with night spirits in this house. Whether these iron objects actually repelled anything more than superstitious fear, I cannot say with certainty, but their presence provided psychological comfort, allowing sleepers to relax with the confidence that they had taken precautions against the unseen dangers of night. And perhaps that confidence itself was protective, allowing for deeper, more restorative sleep. Herbs played a similar protective role. Bundles of dried plants were hung above beds, tucked into pillows, or scattered on the floor around the sleeping area. These herbs served multiple purposes. Their strong scents were believed to purify the air, driving away not only evil spirits, but also the miasmas and bad vapors thought to cause disease. Wormwood, with its bitter, penetrating smell, was particularly favored. It was believed to repel both insects and demons, making it doubly valuable. I can still recall the distinctive aroma of wormwood-scented chambers, sharp, almost medicinal, but not entirely unpleasant once one grew accustomed to it. Juniper branches, rue, and mugwort were similarly employed, their presence announced by the aromatic haze that filled sleeping spaces. Garlic enjoyed special status among protective substances. Braids of garlic bulbs hung near beds, and in some households, cloves of garlic were tucked directly into pillows, or even rubbed on the soles of feet before sleep. The logic was twofold. Garlic was thought to warm the body from within, preventing the chill from taking hold, and it was believed to be particularly repellent to vampiric spirits and disease-bearing demons. The smell of garlic in a medieval bedchamber was pronounced, mixing with the smoke, wool, and human scent to create an atmosphere quite distinct. Yet families grew so accustomed to it that they barely noticed, while visitors often remarked on the pungent aroma that greeted them in homes where garlic protection was practiced. Salt, that precious preservative, also found its way into sleeping rituals. Small pouches of salt might be sewn into pillows or placed beneath the mattress. Salt was understood to be purifying, resistant to corruption, and therefore symbolically opposed to the forces of decay and evil. Some folk practices involved sprinkling salt in a circle around the bed before retiring, creating a protective boundary. Religious symbols and objects provided the most obvious spiritual protection. Crosses were ubiquitous, carved into bed frames, hung on walls, worn around necks, even during sleep. Icons, religious paintings of Christ, Mary, or the saints, occupied honored positions in sleeping chambers, usually placed in the eastern corner of the room. Before sleep, prayers would be offered before these icons. Candles lit if resources permitted, requests for protection made. I have witnessed countless bedtime prayers throughout the centuries, but those in ancient Rus carried a particular intensity born of genuine fear. Parents would gather children before the icon, teaching them the words that might keep them safe. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, watch over us through this dark night. Keep us from evil, from spirits that wander, from sickness and cold. Let us see tomorrow's dawn. The children would repeat these words, their voices small and earnest in the dim chamber. The practice of blessing the bed itself was common in religious households. A priest might be invited to bless a new bed or a chamber after illness had visited it. Holy water would be sprinkled, prayers recited, specific words of blessing spoken over the space where vulnerable sleep would occur. The cost of such blessing was often significant for peasant families, yet they paid it willingly, considering it essential insurance against nighttime dangers. Certain superstitions dictated the positioning of the bed within the chamber. It was generally considered unlucky to place a bed directly beneath a ceiling beam, as beams were believed to press down on sleepers, causing nightmares and illness. Beds should not face certain directions. Accounts vary, but many sources suggest that lying with one's head to the north was particularly dangerous, inviting misfortune. Windows posed their own concerns. Even when shuttered, they were seen as potential entry points for malevolent forces. Households sometimes traced crosses on shutters with chalk or charcoal, creating additional barriers. In extreme cases, Windows might be stuffed with cloth, or even temporarily boarded over during periods when evil was thought to be particularly active. Certain feast days, times of plague, or when strange phenomena had been observed, the threshold of the chamber door received attention as well. Salt might be sprinkled across it, or iron nails driven into the doorframe. Some folk traditions involved specific words that had to be spoken when crossing into a sleeping chamber, formulas that established the space as protected. By God's grace I enter. By God's grace I sleep. By God's grace I wake was one such formula, repeated like a password that granted safe passage. Children were considered particularly vulnerable to spiritual threats during sleep, their souls not yet fully anchored to their bodies, easily called away by malicious spirits or the fairy folk. Special precautions surrounded sleeping children. A piece of the mother's clothing might be placed over a sleeping infant, transferring her protection to the child. Amulets were sewn into children's nightclothes, small cloth pouches containing herbs, tiny crosses, written prayers, or even fragments of consecrated bread from the church. I recall a village mother near Vladimir who crafted such amulets with extraordinary care. She would gather herbs during the summer solstice, believing them most potent when plucked at that time of maximum light. These she dried carefully, then mixed with threads pulled from her own wedding garment cloth that had been blessed during the marriage ceremony. Into a small linen pouch, no larger than a walnut, she would place the herbs, the threads, and a tiny wooden cross carved by her husband. This pouch was then sewn into the collar of each child's sleeping shift, positioned over the heart. The evil ones cannot abide the protection of mother's love made manifest, she told me, her fingers working the needle with practiced precision. This amulet carries my prayers, my blessing, the sanctity of my marriage, and the power of herbs gathered in God's light. What demon could penetrate such defenses? Whether her confidence was justified by supernatural protection or simply by the psychological comfort it provided. Both mother and child, the children in that household, slept peacefully through winters that tested many others. The fear of the night hag, known by various names across the lands of Rus, Kikamora, Mora, or simply the mare, was particularly acute regarding children. This malevolent spirit was believed to sit upon the chests of sleepers, causing nightmares, difficulty breathing, and, in extreme cases, death by suffocation. The phenomenon we now call sleep paralysis was interpreted through this lens of spiritual attack. Protection against the mare involved multiple strategies. Red thread was considered particularly powerful. Some households tied a length of red thread around a child's wrist before sleep, believing the bright color confused or repelled the spirit. Others drew crosses in red ochre on the headboard or wall above where children slept. The color red itself was thought to possess apotropaic properties, capable of turning away evil. Certain prayers were taught specifically for protection against the mare. Children learned to recite these before closing their eyes. St. George, holy warrior, guard me through this night. Let no evil spirit press upon my chest, no demon steal my breath. By the power of the cross, by the grace of God, I am protected. The rhythmic repetition of such prayers served dual purposes: spiritual protection and a calming ritual that eased children into sleep. The placement of children's beds within the chamber was carefully considered. Ideally, a child should sleep where moonlight could touch them, for moonlight was considered purifying, driving away shadows where evil might lurk. Yet windows also posed danger, being potential entry points. The solution was to position beds where moonlight might reach them through the window, but not directly beneath the window opening itself. Adults, too, sought protection beyond the physical warmth and comfort of their beds. The practice of prayer before sleep was nearly universal, crossing all social boundaries. In peasant households, the entire family might kneel together before the icon corner, reciting familiar prayers as the last act before retiring. These prayers acknowledged vulnerability and requested divine protection through the dangerous hours of darkness. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on us. Holy Mother of God, spread your protective veil over this household. Guard us from fire, from cold, from illness, from evil spirits, from all harm. Let us see tomorrow's light. Amen. Such prayers were repeated nightly, their words worn smooth by countless utterances, yet never losing their earnest power. Monks in monasteries followed more elaborate prayer rituals. Before the dormitory fell silent, the abbot or designated brother would walk through the hall, sprinkling holy water and reciting specific psalms. Each monk would then perform private devotions at his bedside, prayers for protection, for the souls of the departed, for strength to face tomorrow's spiritual battles. Only after these rituals were complete would they lie down, secure in the knowledge that both physical community and spiritual observance surrounded them. Noble households sometimes employed priests or monks as permanent residents, partly for their spiritual services. These religious figures would bless chambers regularly, particularly after illness or misfortune. I remember a Bojar's house in Tivier, where a monk lived in a small cell adjacent to the family's sleeping quarters. Each evening, he would ring a small bell and recite prayers that could be heard throughout the household. The family found great comfort in these sounds, feeling that divine protection was actively maintained rather than simply hoped for. But spiritual protection extended beyond Christian practices. Older beliefs, rooted in the pre-Christian past, persisted alongside and sometimes intermingled with church teachings. The domovoi, the house spirit believed to dwell in every home, required its own acknowledgments and appeasements. This entity was thought to protect the household if properly respected, but could cause mischief or worse if offended. Before sleep, some families left small offerings for the domovoi, a bit of bread, a cup of milk or porridge, placed near the hearth or in a corner designated as the spirit's dwelling place. Good domovoi, guardian of this house, we honor you and ask your protection through the night. Keep our fire safe, guard our children, warn us of danger. These words, whispered as the offering was placed, represented a spiritual transaction older than Christianity, yet adapted to coexist with it. The Russian Orthodox Church officially disapproved of such practices, considering them pagan superstition. Yet priests often turned a blind eye, understanding that these ancient beliefs provided comfort and continuity with the past. Some priests even reasoned that any belief that encouraged household harmony and protection of family was not entirely contrary to Christian teaching, even if its origins lay in older traditions. Dreams were understood as a realm where the spiritual and physical worlds intersected, where messages might be received, but where dangers also lurked. Nightmares were not merely random firings of an anxious mind, but were interpreted as spiritual attacks or warnings. To ward off troubling dreams, people employed various techniques. Some folk traditions involved placing certain objects under the pillow to promote peaceful sleep. A handful of grain or wheat was thought to bring dreams of abundance and prevent nightmares of hunger, particularly important. During winter, when food stores dwindled, a small mirror placed beneath the pillow was believed to reflect bad dreams away, preventing them from taking hold. River stones, smoothed by water, were thought to carry the calming influence of flowing water into sleep. The timing of sleep itself carried spiritual implications. It was considered dangerous to fall asleep during twilight, that liminal period between day and night when boundaries between worlds were thought to be most permeable. Families made effort to either retire fully before twilight or wait until full darkness had fallen. The in-between time was for prayer and preparation, not for vulnerable sleep. Similarly, certain nights of the year were considered more spiritually dangerous than others. The nights around the winter solstice, when darkness reigned longest, were times of heightened caution. Extra prayers were recited, additional protective measures taken. The 12 days of Christmas, from the Nativity through Epiphany, were thought to be a period when spirits walked more freely, requiring constant vigilance. On these particularly dangerous nights, some households maintained a vigil, with family members taking turns staying awake through the night to keep the fire burning and to maintain spiritual watchfulness through prayer. It was exhausting, certainly, but the sense of collective protection it provided was considered worth the sacrifice. The fear of premature burial, of being thought dead when merely in deep sleep or illness-induced unconsciousness, led to certain precautions around sleep. People were careful not to sleep too deeply, too motionlessly. The phrase, "sleep like the dead," was considered ominous, an invitation to death itself. Parents sometimes gently touched sleeping children to ensure they stirred, that their sleep was natural and not the dangerous stillness that might presage death. There existed folk beliefs about the soul leaving the body during sleep, traveling to other realms while the physical form rested. This was thought to be natural and necessary for true rest. However, the concern was that the soul might not return, either because it became lost, was captured by malevolent forces, or simply found the other realm more appealing. Hence the importance of prayers and protections. These ensured the soul's safe return to the body by dawn. Sudden awakening was considered dangerous because the soul might not have fully returned. Parents were taught to wake children gradually, with gentle words and touches, giving the soul time to fully re-enter the body. To startle someone awake was not merely unkind, but potentially spiritually harmful. The cross made over one's body before sleep served multiple purposes. With the right hand, one touched forehead, chest, right shoulder, then left shoulder, while reciting in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. This gesture sealed the body with divine protection, creating an invisible armor against evil. I have watched countless people make this sign with such practiced automaticity that their hands moved correctly, even when their minds were already drifting towards sleep. Some households developed elaborate bedtime rituals that combined multiple protective elements. I recall one prosperous merchant family in Scav, whose evening routine proceeded with almost liturgical precision. First, the entire family gathered before the icon corner for evening prayers. Then, the father would walk through each room, carrying a censer filled with incense, purifying the spaces with smoke and prayer. The mother followed, sprinkling blessed water in doorways and windows. Children were then prepared for sleep with careful attention. Each child's feet were washed, a practice with both practical hygiene and symbolic purification purposes. As the mother washed, she recited prayers of protection. The children were dressed in clean sleeping shifts, and their protective amulets were checked to ensure they remained in place. Finally, each child was blessed individually, the parent making the sign of the cross over them while speaking their name and asking for God's protection. Only after all these rituals were complete would the family retire to their beds. The process took perhaps half an hour or more, time that could have been spent sleeping. Yet the family considered it essential, not merely superstitious routine, but necessary spiritual hygiene, as important as physical warmth. The sensory experience of these protective rituals became deeply associated with safety and sleep. The smell of incense burning, the cool touch of blessed water on the forehead, the familiar words of prayers repeated since childhood, all of these created a psychological state conducive to rest. The body learned that these signals meant safety, meant it was time to relax, to trust in protections both seen and unseen. In times of particular danger, during plagues, after deaths in the household, following reports of evil omens, protective measures were intensified. Additional prayers, more frequent blessings, sometimes even the presence of a priest throughout the night. Fear was acknowledged and addressed through ritual, through spiritual action, giving people a sense of agency in the face of threats they could not control by ordinary means. Yet there was wisdom beneath the superstition. These protective rituals served psychological purposes that transcended their supernatural justifications. They reduced anxiety, created comforting routines, strengthened family bonds through shared practices, and gave people tools for managing the very real fears that darkness and winter brought. Whether the iron truly repelled demons or simply made people feel secure enough to sleep deeply, the result was the same: better rest, greater resilience, improved survival. The interplay between Christian and pre-Christian beliefs in these protective practices reveals the complexity of medieval spirituality in Rus. The Church provided the official framework, the prayers and blessings, and holy objects. But beneath this ran older currents, the domovoi, the protective herbs, the power of red thread, the significance of iron. Rather than replacing the old beliefs, Christianity absorbed and reinterpreted them, creating a layered system of protection that drew from multiple traditions. I have lived long enough to see beliefs change, to watch how people make sense of their world through the lenses available to them. In ancient Rus, the lens was spiritual: cold, illness, danger. All were understood as having spiritual dimensions, requiring spiritual responses. Modern people might smile at such beliefs, considering them quaint superstitions. Yet those beliefs served their purpose, allowing people to face terrors, both real and imagined, with courage drawn from faith. And perhaps there is something we have lost. The modern world has shed many superstitions, gained much understanding, yet perhaps also lost some sense of the sacred, of the mysterious. To the people of ancient Rus, sleep was not merely a biological process, but a spiritual journey, a nightly voyage into vulnerable darkness from which one hoped to return transformed by rest. Every night was an act of faith, every dawn a small resurrection. So as you prepare for your own sleep tonight, in your warm, safe, modern bed, consider the weight of belief that medieval sleepers carried with them into darkness. Their iron and herbs and prayers, their careful rituals and whispered words. These were not merely superstition, but acts of courage, assertions that human will and faith could create safety even in the heart of winter's killing cold. They slept not in ignorance, but in hope, not passively but actively defending their rest with every tool their culture provided. Sleep in ancient Rus was not always achieved, no matter how carefully one prepared. Winter brought not only cold, but illness, waves of sickness that swept through households, villages, entire regions. To sleep while ill, or to sleep near those who were ill, added layers of danger and discomfort to an already challenging situation. Respiratory ailments were perhaps the most common winter afflictions. The smoky air of constantly burning fires irritated lungs and throats. The cold itself stressed the body's defenses. People crowded together for warmth, sharing air and spreading contagion efficiently. Coughs, fevers, chills, difficulty breathing. These symptoms appeared with dreary regularity once winter settled in. I recall winters when it seemed every household echoed with coughing, when one could walk through a village at night and hear the chorus of illness from every dwelling. The sound was distinctive, wet, rattling coughs that spoke of lungs filled with fluid, dry, hacking coughs that tore at throats, the whooping gasps of children struggling for air. These sounds interrupted sleep, both for the sufferers and for those who shared their chambers. The medieval understanding of illness was rooted in humoral theory, inherited from Greek medicine and adapted to local circumstances. Sickness resulted from imbalances in the bodies for humors, blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, black bile. Cold, damp conditions were thought to increase phlegm, leading to respiratory complaints. The body's natural warmth was believed to be fighting a losing battle against the cold's invasion. Treatment focused on restoring warmth and balance. Hot drinks were prescribed, herbal infusions of thyme, elderflower, or mint, sweetened with honey if available. These were consumed before sleep, their heat intended to drive out cold humors and soothe irritated throats. I have prepared countless such remedies, watching the steam rise from wooden cups, breathing in the medicinal aromas that filled chambers. Poultices and plasters were applied to the chest, mixtures of heated herbs, animal fat, and sometimes bread soaked in wine or ale, wrapped in cloth and placed against the skin. The theory was that heat and medicinal properties would penetrate the body, reaching the lungs and driving out sickness. Whether these treatments had genuine therapeutic effect or merely provided psychological comfort and slight warmth, they were employed faithfully. Some remedies bordered on the extreme. Bloodletting was sometimes prescribed, based on the theory that removing excess blood would rebalance the humors. I have watched barber surgeons open veins, collecting blood into bowls, the patient growing pale and weak before being sent back to bed to sleep. The practice was risky, weakening already compromised individuals, yet it persisted because humoral theory demanded it. Quarantine, in a rudimentary form, was practiced when illness struck. The very ill might be isolated to a separate sleeping area, if space permitted, though this was often impossible in small dwellings where every corner was needed for living. In larger households, sick chambers existed where those with serious illness could be tended while keeping them separated from the healthy. Yet complete isolation was rare. Families stayed together even through illness, accepting that sickness was communal, would spread through the household regardless of precautions. Parents nursed sick children through the night, holding them close despite risk of contagion, for the comfort and warmth of human contact was considered essential to healing. I remember a plague winter, though which plague, in which year, my memory blurs across too many similar horrors. The sickness came with the cold, striking swiftly and cruelly. Fever burned while outside, the world froze. People, delirious with illness, threw off their blankets, exposing themselves to killing cold, requiring constant watching to prevent them from harming themselves. In that terrible time, sleep became nearly impossible. The ill tossed and moaned, crying out in fever dreams. Caregivers dozed fitfully between their duties, starting awake at every sound. The healthy slept lightly, fearful that they might be next, alert for the first signs of fever in their own bodies. The entire rhythm of segmented sleep collapsed under the weight of crisis. Days and nights blurred together in exhausting cycles of care and fear. The sensory experience of sleeping in a chamber where illness reigned was overwhelming. The smell, sweat, sickness, the herbal remedies, the chamber pots that could not always be emptied frequently enough. The sounds, moaning, coughing, the rasp of labored breathing, the whispered prayers of those keeping vigil. The sight, bodies tossing restlessly, skin flushed with fever or pale with weakness. The faces of loved ones transformed by suffering. Folk remedies proliferated, passed down through generations, varying by region, but sharing common themes. Garlic appeared again, now not just for warming and protection, but as supposed medicine against illness. Some traditions involved tying bags of heated salt around the throat for respiratory complaints, or placing heated bricks wrapped in cloth against the chest. Whether these provided real benefit or merely distraction from misery, they were applied with hope. Prayer intensified during illness. Special intercessions to healing saints, Saint Pantaleon, Saint Nicholas, the Mother of God, were recited continuously. In Orthodox tradition, certain icons were believed to have particular healing powers. If a family possessed such an icon, it might be brought to the bedside of the ill-positioned, where the sufferer could see it, a visible reminder of divine mercy and hope for recovery. Monasteries and churches sometimes maintained shrines to healing saints, where the sick could sleep in hope of miraculous cure. I have visited such places, cold stone chapels, where the desperately ill lay on thin pallets before icons, their prayers mingling with those of monks and the smoke of incense. Some recovered, whether from divine intervention, the simple rest, or the body's own healing processes. Many did not. Yet the attempt represented hope, the human refusal to surrender passively to death. The winter illnesses extracted a terrible toll, particularly from the very young and very old. Children's bodies, less resilient, succumbed quickly to fevers and respiratory distress. The elderly, weakened by age and the accumulated hardships of life, had little reserve strength to fight off sickness. A household might enter winter with 3 generations and emerge in spring with 1. The grief was private and communal simultaneously. Families mourned their losses while still struggling to survive, for winter did not pause for grief. The dead were often held in outbuildings until the ground thawed enough for burial, a practical necessity that meant the deceased remained nearby, a constant reminder of mortality. Sleep in households where death had visited carried the weight of loss, the empty places where loved ones had lain. Yet life continued with stubborn persistence. Survivors cared for each other, redistributed the blankets and sleeping spaces of the dead to the living, and carried on. There was a stoicism born of necessity, an acceptance that death was winter's companion, and that one could only do one's best and hope for mercy. Some winters were worse than others. Epidemic years, when illness swept broadly, left communities devastated. I recall one such winter when a village near Novgorod lost nearly a third of its inhabitants. The survivors moved together, consolidating households, for there were now more dwellings than people to fill them. Children orphaned by illness were absorbed into other families, adding to the crowded sleeping arrangements, but preserving community and ensuring no one faced the cold alone. The psychological impact of sleeping surrounded by illness and death cannot be understated. Fear became a constant companion. Every cough, every moment of feeling unwell carried the terror that this might be the beginning of fatal illness. People lay awake in the dark, monitoring their own bodies for signs of fever, fearing sleep itself because sleep made one vulnerable, unaware of the sickness that might be developing. Yet exhaustion eventually overcame fear. Bodies demanded rest regardless of circumstances. People slept not peacefully, but because they could no longer maintain consciousness. This was not the restorative sleep of health, but the collapse of overwhelmed systems. Yet it was still sleep, still offering some recovery. Medical knowledge, limited as it was, did offer some genuine insights. Physicians understood that rest was crucial for recovery, that the body healed better during sleep. They prescribed bed rest, sometimes for weeks, accompanied by warmth, nourishing foods, if available, and medicinal drinks. The wealthy could afford to follow such prescriptions, lying in comfortable beds while servants attended them. The poor had to balance rest against the necessities of survival, often returning to work before fully healed, risking relapse. The role of women as healers and caregivers was central to managing winter illness. Mothers and grandmothers were the first line of medical care. Their knowledge of herbs and remedies, the difference between recovery and death. They prepared the medicines, administered the treatments, kept vigil through the night, monitoring the ill for changes in condition. I have watched these women work with admiration, their hands never still, moving from one patient to another, adjusting blankets, offering sips of warm tea, placing cool cloths on fevered foreheads. Their own sleep became fragmented, snatched in brief moments when patients rested quietly. They survived on determination and love, pushing past their own exhaustion to care for their families. Herbal knowledge was extensive and carefully guarded. Women knew which plants brought down fever, which cleared congestion, which strengthened the body's defenses. Willow bark tea for fever, elderflower for sweating out illness, mint for soothing upset stomachs, thyme for coughs. These remedies had been tested across generations and held genuine medicinal properties that modern science has confirmed. The gathering and preparation of medicinal herbs was primarily women's work, done during summer when plants were at peak potency. They were dried carefully, stored in dry places, rationed through winter for maximum effect. A household's medicinal herb supply was as important as its food stores, perhaps more so, for what use was food if illness prevented one from eating? Sleep aids were sometimes employed when pain or discomfort made rest impossible. Poppy preparations, opium in various forms, were known and used, though carefully due to their strength and rarity. More commonly, people relied on herbal teas with mild sedative properties, valerian root, chamomile, hops. These gentler remedies helped ease anxiety and promote sleep without the risks of stronger substances. The connection between sleep and healing was well understood, even if the mechanisms were not. Physicians noted that patients who slept well recovered faster than those who tossed restlessly through the night. Therefore, ensuring good sleep became a treatment priority. Chambers were kept quiet, fires maintained at comfortable levels. pain managed as best as possible, all to promote the healing sleep the body required. But some illnesses brought sleep disturbances as symptoms rather than merely interfering with rest. High fevers caused delirium, vivid hallucinations, terrors that jolted patients awake, screaming. These fever dreams were interpreted as spiritual attacks, demons tormenting the vulnerable sick. Priests might be called to perform exorcisms or special blessings, addressing both the physical illness and its supposed spiritual dimensions. The question of contagion was understood imperfectly. People recognized that illness spread through communities, that caring for the sick put one at risk. Yet the mechanisms, germs, viruses, bacteria, were unknown. Instead, illness was thought to spread through bad air, through miasmas, through the imbalance of humors. This led to practices like burning aromatic woods or herbs to purify the air, which may have provided some mild antiseptic effect through smoke, but primarily offered psychological comfort. Isolation of the sick, while sometimes practiced, conflicted with cultural values around community and care. To abandon the ill was considered deeply shameful, a failure of family and Christian duty. Therefore, people accepted risk as the price of compassion, staying with sick loved ones despite danger, holding their hands through the long nights, offering comfort even when cure was impossible. The intersection of sleep and illness reveals the precarious balance of medieval life. Rest was essential for both prevention and recovery, yet circumstances often made adequate rest impossible. The cold that required so much energy to fight weakened immune defenses. The crowding that kept people warm also spread sickness efficiently. The smoke that provided heat-damaged lungs. Every survival strategy carried hidden costs. As spring finally approached and temperatures rose, illness often surged one final time. Bodies weakened by months of winter, diminished food stores, leaving people malnourished. The psychological exhaustion of enduring endless cold. All of this created vulnerability. The transition from winter to spring, which should have brought relief, instead often brought a final wave of death, taking those who had survived the worst but lacked strength for the finish. Yet those who made it through, who saw true spring arrive, felt genuine warmth from the sun, breathed air that did not bite the lungs. These survivors carried hard-won knowledge. They had learned what remedies helped, what prayers brought comfort, how to organize care and maintain hope through the darkest times. This knowledge would be remembered, passed to the next generation, used to face future winters with slightly better preparation. So remember, as you rest in your temperature-controlled room with access to modern medicine and clean water, what a luxury such security represents. The people of ancient Rus slept through winter, knowing that illness might strike at any moment, that the care available was limited, that survival was never guaranteed. Yet they persisted with courage that defied their circumstances, caring for each other with devotion that transcended fear, finding in shared suffering the bonds that made life worth preserving. Their nights were long and often filled with suffering, but they faced them together, and in that togetherness found strength enough to endure until morning. Dawn came grudgingly in the depths of winter, the sun rising late and traveling a low arc that barely cleared the horizon. The first light of morning seeped into chambers gradually, not the sudden brilliance of summer sunrise, but a slow graying of darkness, an incremental revelation that night was finally releasing its hold. To wake in a medieval Rus household was to face an immediate test of will. The bed, for all its discomforts, had become familiar. The layers of wool and fur, the shared warmth of family or companions, the relative safety of the sleeping cocoon. All of this had to be abandoned for the hostile cold that ruled the chamber beyond the covers. I have watched this morning struggle countless times across the centuries, and it never ceased to move me. The first stirring, someone becoming aware of wakefulness, lying still for a moment as consciousness returned, remembering where they were and what faced them, the reluctance visible in their hesitation, the way they pulled covers tighter for one more moment of warmth before accepting that the day must begin. Often the first sound was a sigh, half resignation, half determination. Then movement under the blankets as the person prepared themselves mentally for what came next. Finally, the decisive moment, throwing back the covers and sitting up, gasping as cold air struck skin, reaching immediately for additional clothing to wrap around themselves. The floor was always shockingly cold, even when one expected it. Bare feet touching stone or wood that had absorbed all the night's chill produced a jolt that fully dispelled any remaining drowsiness. People learned to move quickly, padding across the freezing floor to where their day clothes waited, often stiff with cold themselves, and requiring a moment near the fire before they could be comfortably worn. The hearth, if properly tended through the night, would still hold embers. The morning's first task, crucial and immediate, was reviving the fire. Someone, often the head of household or the eldest child, would kneel before the hearth, stirring the ashes carefully, adding small pieces of kindling, blowing gently to coax reluctant flames back to life. This was a delicate operation requiring skill and patience. Blow too hard, and you scattered the embers, losing precious heat. Too timidly, and the kindling failed to catch, requiring you to start over. The successful revival of the morning fire was a small victory, the first accomplishment of the day, and it brought both practical warmth and psychological comfort. The household had survived another night, and life continued. As flames caught and began to grow, others in the household stirred. Children were notoriously difficult to wake on cold mornings, burrowing deeper into covers, whimpering protests when urged to rise. Parents employed various strategies, gentle coaxing, stern commands, sometimes simply pulling blankets away, forcing the issue. The morning air filled with complaints, negotiations, the small dramas of family life, beginning another day. In peasant households, there was no luxury of lingering in bed. Animals required care regardless of temperature. Cows needed milking, chickens feeding, basic tasks that could not be delayed. Men and older boys dressed quickly, pulling on multiple layers, wrapping cloths around their heads and necks, preparing for the brief but brutal journey to the barn or stable. These morning animal duties were, paradoxically, sometimes easier in winter than in other seasons. The animals' body heat had warmed their shelters through the night, making the barn notably warmer than the human dwelling in some cases. I have known farmers who smiled wryly as they moved from their cold cottage to the relatively warm barn, joking that the cows lived better than the people. Women began their morning routines centered around the hearth. Water, if it had not frozen solid overnight, needed heating for washing and for the morning meal. Porridge was prepared. Oats or barley simmered slowly, absorbing warmth and becoming the sustaining foundation of the day. The smell of cooking grain gradually filled the chamber, replacing the stale odors of night with something more wholesome and promising. Faces and hands were washed with heated water, a ritual both hygienic and spiritually significant. The morning wash represented renewal, leaving behind the vulnerabilities of night and preparing to face the day. Some households recited prayers while washing, acknowledging divine mercy for granting another morning, requesting strength for the challenges ahead. Morning prayers were as universal as evening ones, though often briefer due to pressing tasks. Families gathered before the icon corner, made the sign of the cross, recited familiar words, thanking God for protection through the night and asking for guidance through the day. These prayers were hurried sometimes, competing with crying babies and hungry children, but they remained essential, anchoring the day in spiritual observance. In monasteries, the morning routine was more structured and extensive. Monks rose for matins, the pre-dawn service that marked the night's end. This involved leaving warm dormitories for the cold chapel, a sacrifice offered in devotion. The sound of chanting echoed through stone spaces, human voices asserting life and faith against the darkness. After matins came prime, the first service of daylight, followed by communal breakfast. The monastic day was punctuated by these services, providing rhythm and structure. For monks, the transition from sleep to waking was not merely personal, but communal and liturgical, each stage marked by prayer and song. Noble households had servants to manage many morning tasks, but even nobles could not entirely escape winter's demands. They woke in chambers where fires had burned low, where cold had crept in despite every precaution. Servants hurried to revive fires, to bring warm drinks, to assist with dressing in the many layers required for the day. I recall visiting a prince's household one particularly bitter morning. The servant assigned to morning fire duty had overslept, and when the prince woke, his chamber was nearly as cold as outdoors. The prince's fury was legendary. The servant was punished severely, for allowing the fire to die completely was considered a serious failure, potentially life-threatening. The incident illustrated how dependent even the powerful were on others' vigilance, how precarious warmth remained despite wealth and status. The morning meal varied dramatically by social class and available resources. Wealthy households might have bread, cheese, sometimes preserved meats or fish, ale or weak beer. Peasant families often made do with porridge and perhaps a bit of bread if grain stores permitted. Everyone drank water in summer, but in winter, weak ale or heated herbal infusions. For cold water was both unpleasant and thought to be unhealthy, chilling the body from within. Children ate quickly, their young bodies demanding fuel after the night's fast. Parents ate more deliberately, savoring the warmth of food and drink, building strength for the day's labor. The morning meal was often the most substantial feeding of the day, intended to sustain people through hours of physical work in brutal conditions. As daylight strengthened, such as it was in winter, never bright, but at least distinguishable from darkness, people prepared for the day's specific tasks. Men gathered tools, checked on outbuildings, planned the work that weather and season permitted. Women organized household tasks, supervised children, managed the complex logistics of feeding and maintaining a family through winter. The contrast between waking and sleeping states was stark. Sleep, for all its discomforts, represented a kind of peace, a temporary cessation of effort. Waking meant facing cold, hunger, fear, endless labor, the weight of responsibilities. I have seen people's faces change in those first moments of full wakefulness, as the relative peace of sleep gave way to remembered burdens. Yet there was also relief in waking. They had survived another night. The cold had not claimed them. Illness had not struck in the darkness. The morning, harsh as it was, represented victory, life continuing, one more day granted. This was not trivial in a world where survival was never assured, where winter killed casually and often. Morning conversations. As families gathered around the warming hearth for those brief moments before dispersing to tasks, often included comparing nights. Did you sleep well? Was it colder than yesterday? Did you hear the wind? These exchanges were not merely small talk, but intelligence gathering, assessing conditions, sharing the experience of having endured together. Children's morning energy levels varied dramatically. Some woke alert and energetic, their young bodies resilient. Others remained sluggish, particularly if they had been disturbed by cold or illness during the night. Parents learned to read these signs, adjusting expectations and tasks accordingly. Knowing that forcing an exhausted child to perform difficult work was both cruel and inefficient. The elderly often struggled most with mornings. Joints stiffened by cold and age moved reluctantly. The simple act of rising from bed became an ordeal, requiring assistance and patience. Yet elders had their roles in morning routines. They might tend the fire while others worked outside, watch young children prepare food. Their slower pace was accommodated because their wisdom and experience remained valuable. As morning progressed, toward midday, the household found its rhythm. Bodies warmed through activity, though never comfortably in deep winter. The sun, when it appeared through clouds, provided psychological, if not thermal warmth. People settled into the day's demands, the trauma of waking behind them, the distant prospect of evening rest not yet a preoccupation. Looking back from your comfortable modern vantage point, the medieval morning routine might seem unbearably harsh. To wake in genuine cold, to face immediately difficult physical tasks, to have no hot shower or central heating, no coffee machine or toaster. How did they bear it? They bore it because they knew nothing else. This was simply life, the unchanging reality of winter existence. Complaining served no purpose. Cold did not listen to complaints. Action was required. Rising, working, maintaining warmth through movement and effort. The alternative to enduring the harsh morning was to remain in bed, and that path led only to greater cold as fires died and the day's food remained unprepared. There was a certain dignity in this acceptance. I have watched peasants rise in darkness, their breath clouding the air, their movements stiff with cold, yet rising nonetheless. They did not indulge in self-pity or despair. They simply did what needed doing, day after day, winter after winter, year after year. This quiet courage, this persistence in the face of relentless hardship, commands respect across the centuries. The morning also brought social renewal. Households that had been isolated through the long night could now interact with neighbors. Men might gather briefly to discuss the day's work, sharing information about conditions, offering assistance where needed. Women exchanged news, borrowed supplies, checked on each other's welfare. These morning interactions reinforced community bonds that were essential for survival. In villages, smoke rising from chimneys served as a morning roll call. Each household signaled its survival by reviving its fire, sending smoke skyward as visible proof of continued life. Those familiar with their neighbors' patterns would notice if expected smoke failed to appear, prompting someone to check on the household, ensuring that cold or illness had not claimed victims during the night. The morning routines I have described, the reluctant waking, the revival of fire, the hasty dressing, the quick meal, the immediate plunge into work. These were repeated with remarkable consistency across social classes. Whether in peasant hut or noble hall, the fundamental pattern remained the same, because the fundamental challenge remained the same. The cold had to be fought from the moment of waking. Yet, despite the hardship, mornings in ancient Rus were not without their moments of beauty. The quality of winter light, low and golden when the sun finally cleared the horizon, had a particular clarity that summer never achieved. Snow-covered landscapes sparkled with almost painful brilliance. The air, brutally cold, was also crystalline and pure, unmarred by the dust and humidity of warmer seasons. I recall mornings when stepping outside, that necessary venture to fetch water or check animals revealed a world transformed. Frost had decorated every surface with intricate patterns. Icicles hung from eaves, catching and refracting light. The silence was profound, snow muffling all sound, creating a sense of suspended time. These moments were brief, for cold forced quick returns indoors, but they offered glimpses of winter's stark majesty. Children, resilient in ways adults envied, often found joy even in harsh mornings. The first snow of the day might trigger excited play, snowball fights erupting spontaneously before parents called them back to tasks. Icicles became temporary toys, swords for imaginary battles, or treats to suck despite parental warnings. This capacity for finding delight amid hardship was perhaps children's greatest gift, reminding adults that life contained more than mere survival. The progression from night to morning represented more than a temporal shift. It was a psychological journey from vulnerability to agency. In sleep, one was passive, subject to cold and threat. In waking, one became active, able to fight back through work and will. This transition empowered people, gave them back control, even if that control was limited and hard-won. For those who had experienced truly difficult nights, disrupted by illness, plagued by cold, troubled by fear, the morning brought particular relief. The nights, demons, literal or figurative, lost their power in daylight. Problems that had seemed insurmountable in darkness became manageable in morning's revealing light. This daily resurrection, this emergence from night's depths, renewed hope that had faltered in the dark hours. Yet we must acknowledge that not everyone woke successfully. The morning routine I have described presumed survival, but winter claimed many during the night. Families sometimes discovered that the elderly grandmother, who had seemed merely sleeping, had, in fact, passed quietly in the darkness. Children whose coughs had seemed manageable the night before were found cold and still by morning light. These losses punctuated winter's long span, sharp reminders of life's fragility. The discovery of death in the morning was particularly traumatic. The household had been focused on revival, of fire, of warmth, of daily life. To find instead that a member had departed created a jarring dissonance. Yet even grief had to be managed practically. Bodies could not be buried in frozen ground. They had to be stored until spring. Life, for the living, had to continue. Children still needed feeding. Animals still required care. Survival still demanded attention. This harsh necessity that one could not pause to fully grieve because survival required constant vigilance shaped the emotional landscape of medieval life. Grief was compressed, compartmentalized, dealt with in stolen moments rather than through extended mourning. This was not callousness, but adaptation to circumstances that permitted no other choice. The mourning also brought assessment of resources. How much firewood remained? How were food stores holding? Was everyone healthy, or were there signs of developing illness? These evaluations, conducted daily, allowed households to anticipate problems before they became crises, to seek help or adjust plans while time remained. Communication with the outside world resumed with morning. If weather permitted, travel became possible. Merchants who had sheltered overnight in inns prepared to continue their journeys. Messengers carried letters and news between settlements. The isolation of night gave way to the connected world of day, information and goods flowing once more along winter roads. Markets, when they operated in winter, came alive in morning hours. Despite cold, people needed to trade, selling surplus when they had it, buying necessities when stores ran low. I have walked through winter markets where vendors stamped their feet to maintain circulation, where buyers haggled with breath clouding the air, where the desperate need for commerce overcame the desperate wish to remain indoors. The rhythm of morning work gradually warmed bodies, chilled by night and waking. Physical labor, while exhausting, generated heat from within. This internal furnace, fueled by the morning meal and sustained by movement, was more reliable than any external fire. People learned to work steadily rather than frantically, maintaining a pace that kept them warm without causing sweat that would later chill dangerously. By midday, if weather cooperated, temperatures might rise enough to feel almost pleasant, particularly when standing in direct sunlight. These midday reprieves were treasured, moments to pause and absorb what warmth the winter sun offered. People turned their faces skyward, closing their eyes, storing up the memory of warmth against the certainty of evening's return to cold. The prospect of the coming night began to color afternoon's work. Firewood needed gathering for the evening. Food for supper required preparation. Bedding that had been aired needed to be brought back inside before darkness fell. The cycle was beginning again, and people prepared with the knowledge that another night's battle approached. Yet there was satisfaction in this preparation. Each log added to the woodpile was armor against the coming cold. Each task completed was one fewer burden to carry into the evening. The rhythm of daily life, for all its hardships, provided structure and meaning. People knew what needed doing and found purpose in doing it well. I have observed that modern people often struggle with winter's darkness, feeling their energy and spirits flag as days shorten. Medieval people certainly experienced this as well, but perhaps their constant physical demands left less room for such reflections. They were too busy surviving to suffer the psychological malaise of inactivity. Work, in this sense, was both burden and blessing. It exhausted, but it also distracted and provided purpose. The interplay between sleep and waking, between night and day, created a fundamental rhythm that governed medieval life. Night was for rest and restoration, for consolidating the day's experiences and marshaling strength. Morning was for renewal and action, for engaging with the world's demands. This rhythm, dictated by the sun's movement and the body's needs, was more pronounced in winter when light and warmth were precious and fleeting. As the sun began its descent toward afternoon, people worked with increased urgency, knowing that productive time was limited. The window of relative warmth and adequate light would close soon. Tasks not completed before darkness fell would have to wait until tomorrow, and tomorrow's challenges would be compounded by today's unfinished business. So the day progressed, waking, working, preparing, always with awareness of the approaching night. The morning's victory over darkness and cold was temporary, requiring renewal each day. There was no permanent conquest of winter, only daily negotiations, small battles won and lost, survival measured in sunrises, witnessed rather than in comfort achieved. Winter, for all its cruelty, was not eternal, though in its depths it surely felt so. Spring arrived eventually, tentatively at first, a gentle suggestion rather than a bold declaration. The people of ancient Rus watched for its signs with desperate attention, searching for proof that their endurance had earned them another season of life. The first hints came in late February or March, depending on the year and region. Days grew incrementally longer, the sun rising earlier and setting later. The difference might be mere minutes at first, barely perceptible, yet people noticed and took hope. Light was returning, promised warmth would follow, eventually. The sun's arc across the sky grew higher, its light striking the earth at less oblique angles. On clear days, the quality of sunlight changed, no longer the weak, watery illumination of deep winter, but something with genuine warmth in it. People paused in their work to turn faces toward this strengthening sun, eyes closed, feeling the first real heat in months touching their skin. Snow began its slow retreat. Roofs dripped as daytime temperatures rose above freezing. Icicles, losing their battle with the sun, falling and shattering with musical tinkling sounds that announced transformation. This dripping, initially subtle, became a constant background music of melting, of winter's fortress walls slowly crumbling. The first bare patches of ground appeared, where snow cover had been thinnest, or where sunlight struck most directly. These small revelations of earth, dark, sodden, but unmistakably solid ground rather than snow, were celebrated discoveries. Children ran to touch the exposed earth, marveling at its solidity after months of walking only on snow. Birds returned, their migration north a confirmation that warmth was spreading across the land. The first robin or lark spotted prompted excited announcements. Families calling to each other to witness this herald of changing seasons. Birdsong, absent through winter's silence, gradually filled mornings again, a choir welcoming the sun's return. I recall the joy these seasonal changes brought, how they lightened spirits and renewed hope that had grown thin. Winter's psychological weight lifted incrementally with each sign of spring's approach. Conversations shifted from grim endurance to planning for the season ahead, when to begin plowing, what crops to plant, what repairs winter had made necessary. The ice on rivers and lakes began to crack and shift, groaning as it broke apart. This process, called ice out, was both dangerous and thrilling. People gathered to watch the spectacle as massive ice sheets fractured and began to move, the rivers reclaiming their flow. It was a violent transition, ice grinding against ice, water surging beneath, and eventually overwhelming frozen barriers. Muddy season followed ice out, the ground becoming nearly impassable as accumulated snow melted into earth that had been frozen solid. This was an awkward transition period, too warm for snow travel with sleds, too muddy for wheeled carts. Villages became isolated again briefly, but now by mud rather than snow, and the isolation felt temporary rather than threatening because spring's arrival was assured. Sleeping became progressively easier and more pleasant as temperatures moderated. Nights no longer required every possible layer and covering. People could breathe without their breath clouding the air. The morning shock of leaving warm bedding diminished as chambers grew less hostile. Sleep itself deepened and became more restorative as bodies relaxed from winter's constant tension. The segmented sleep pattern that had dominated winter began to shift back toward consolidated rest. As nights grew shorter, the interval between first and second sleep compressed naturally. Eventually, many people returned to sleeping in a single stretch, though some retained the habit of midnight waking, even in warmer seasons. Winter's demands leaving lasting imprints on sleeping patterns. Beds could be aired properly for the first time in months. Straw mattresses were taken outside, beaten to remove dust and pests, refreshed with new straw. Blankets and furs were hung in sunlight and fresh air, their accumulated winter smells of smoke and bodies gradually dissipating. This spring cleaning was both practical hygiene and symbolic renewal, purging the dwelling of winter's residue. Windows and doors, sealed tightly through cold months, could be opened. Fresh air flooded chambers, replacing the stale, smoky atmosphere that had prevailed. The sensory transformation was remarkable. Suddenly, indoor spaces smelled of spring rather than winter, of new growth rather than smoke and wool. People breathed deeply, filling lungs with air that did not sting or choke. Yet spring was not without dangers. The transition between seasons brought its own illnesses. Bodies weakened by winter's deprivations were vulnerable to infections. Melting snow and flooding could contaminate water sources. The same spring warmth that revived the land also awakened pests and diseases that had been dormant. Moreover, food stores reached their lowest point in late winter and early spring. The grain harvested in autumn had sustained the household for months, but by spring, reserves were often exhausted. Hunger intensified even as cold diminished. This contradiction, the season of renewal also being the season of greatest hunger, was one of nature's cruelties. The hungry time of spring drove people to seek any available food. Early greens, bitter and barely nutritious, were gathered as soon as they appeared. Tree bark might be stripped and ground into flour. Preservation of stored foods shifted from preventing freezing to preventing rot and pest infestation as temperatures warmed. Every household became expert at stretching meager supplies until new crops could be harvested. I remember a village woman telling me, "We survive winter only to nearly starve in spring." Her bitter observation captured the paradox. Winter's cold could kill directly, but spring's hunger, undermining health, just as the body needed strength to plant and work, claimed its own victims. Those who had survived winter's worst sometimes did not live to see summer's abundance. Yet for those who endured, spring brought incomparable joy. The first meal made from fresh greens, however bitter, tasted of hope. The ability to work outdoors without layers of heavy clothing felt like liberation. The sight of fields greening, of trees budding, of flowers appearing. These were not merely pleasant, but miraculous after the monochrome world of winter. Sleep in spring chambers became genuinely comfortable for the first time in months. Moderate temperatures meant one could sleep without elaborate preparations, without fear of freezing, without needing to huddle for warmth. Blankets that had been essential became optional. The bed curtains that had trapped heat could be left open, allowing one to see the room rather than being enclosed in darkness. Children's sleep improved dramatically with spring's arrival. No longer disturbed by cold or crowded against siblings for warmth, they could spread out and rest peacefully. Their energy levels surged, young bodies responding to better conditions with remarkable resilience. Parents marveled at the transformation. seeing their children become vibrant again after winter's pallor and lethargy. The elderly, too, benefited profoundly from warming temperatures. Joints loosened, breathing came easier. The constant battle against cold ceased to drain their limited strength. Many who had seemed near death during winter's worst rallied spectacularly in spring, gaining months or years of additional life because they had survived to reach kinder conditions. As spring progressed toward summer, the memory of winter's harshness began to fade. Not entirely, the dead remained buried. Losses were not forgotten, but the immediacy of suffering receded. People could look back on winter from the safety of warmth and growing food security, processing what they had endured now that endurance was no longer required. This psychological processing was essential. The trauma of winter, the fear, the discomfort, the losses needed to be integrated so that people could face the next winter when it came. Stories were told of winter's worst moments, turning suffering into narrative, making sense of chaos. These stories served to educate the young, to bond communities through shared experience, and to prepare mentally for future trials. Gratitude became palpable in spring. The simple ability to be warm, to have adequate food, to sleep comfortably, these became occasions for thanksgiving. Religious festivals in spring carried special fervor, prayers of gratitude offered for survival, petitions made that the coming year might be more merciful than the last. I have participated in countless spring celebrations across the centuries, and those in ancient Rus held particular intensity. The joy was not frivolous or superficial, but profound, a recognition that life had been preserved against significant odds, that the community endured, that the cycle would continue. Dancing, feasting, when food allowed, music, laughter, these were not merely entertainment, but essential reaffirmations of vitality. The contrast between winter and spring sleeping conditions illustrated dramatically how much environment shaped experience. The same bed that had been a desperate refuge in January became a pleasant resting place in April. The same chamber that had threatened death by cold became comfortable. Nothing physical had changed. The bed, the room, remained the same, yet everything experiential had transformed. This taught people that hardship was not permanent, that conditions changed, that survival through difficult periods brought reward. This lesson, learned viscerally through the body's experience of seasonal transition, provided psychological resilience. If winter could give way to spring, then other hardships too might eventually ease. The preparation for next winter began even as spring unfolded. Wood needed cutting and storing. Preserved foods prepared repairs to structures completed while weather allowed. People who had just survived one winter immediately began preparing for the next, an eternal cycle of preparation and endurance that defined life in this harsh land. Yet this preparation was undertaken with lighter spirits than winter's grim survival mode, working in sunshine and warmth, with growing food supplies and lengthening days, made labor feel productive rather than merely defensive. People could build for the future rather than simply defending against the present. As I reflect across centuries on these seasonal cycles, I am struck by human adaptability and resilience. The same people who shivered through winter nights, who fought constantly against cold and hunger and death, transformed with the seasons. Spring revealed that beneath winter's harsh demands lived hope and vitality that cold could suppress but never entirely extinguish. The gift of spring was not merely warmth and food, though these were precious. The deeper gift was renewal, of hope, of energy, of possibility. It reminded people that change was the fundamental nature of existence, that nothing, however difficult, lasted forever. This gift sustained them through the next winter and the one after that, across years and lifetimes of seasonal cycles. So spring arrived, thawed the frozen earth, revived dormant life, and reminded the people of ancient Rus why survival mattered. They had endured winter, not merely to continue existing, but to reach this renewal, to experience again the world's beauty and bounty, to raise children and plant crops and tell stories around fires that warmed rather than just barely kept death at bay. As I sit here in the twilight of ages, memories of countless winters blend and separate like snowflakes in a storm, each one distinct, yet part of an endless pattern. I have watched empires rise and fall, technologies transform daily life, comforts multiply beyond medieval imagination. Yet the fundamental challenge, the human struggle to find warmth and rest in a cold world, remains recognizable across the centuries. The people of ancient Rus who survived those brutal winters were not so different from people today. They feared and hoped, loved and grieved, endured and sometimes despaired. What distinguished them was not superior nature, but necessity. They had no choice but to adapt, to innovate within severe constraints, to find solutions or perish. Their sleeping strategies, the layered bedding, the shared warmth, the careful fire management, the protective rituals, represented accumulated wisdom refined across generations. Each practice, whether rooted in accurate understanding or superstitious belief, served purposes both practical and psychological. Together, these strategies created a system that, while never guaranteeing comfort, provided sufficient probability of survival to allow communities to persist. I have emphasized throughout this tale the sensory experience of medieval sleep, the scratch of wool, the smell of smoke, the weight of furs, the crackle of fire, because these tangible details connect us across time. When you pull your own blanket closer tonight, you perform a gesture unchanged in essence from those made by peasants and princes in medieval Rus. The form may differ, but the seeking of warmth and security remains constant. The social dimensions of medieval sleep carry lessons perhaps more relevant than the physical strategies. The willingness to share space and warmth, to sacrifice individual comfort for collective survival, to care for the vulnerable, even at personal risk. These represented choices, not inevitable responses. Communities that maintained these practices endured. Those that did not, fragmented under winter's pressure. Modern life, with its emphasis on privacy and individual space, has gained much, but perhaps lost something as well. Few today would willingly share their bed with strangers in an inn or pack entire families into a single sleeping chamber. Yet, in that lost communality was a recognition of interdependence, an acknowledgement that survival was collective rather than individual. We would do well to remember this wisdom, even as we enjoy our private, temperature-controlled bedrooms. The spiritual dimensions of medieval sleep, the prayers and protections, the belief that rest required divine guardianship, speak to human need for meaning beyond material circumstances. Whether the iron truly repelled demons matters less than that people felt protected, that they could surrender to sleep's vulnerability with faith that something watched over them. Modern secularism has not eliminated this need. It has merely changed the forms through which people seek such comfort. The rhythm of segmented sleep, which has largely disappeared from modern experience, may have offered benefits we only now begin to appreciate. That quiet hour of midnight wakefulness, used for prayer or reflection or intimate conversation, represented a space outside the day's demands. Some researchers suggest our current insistence on consolidated sleep may be fighting rather than accommodating natural human rhythms. Perhaps the medieval pattern, born of necessity, was also aligned with deeper biological cycles. The morning struggle I described, the reluctance to leave warmth, the shock of cold, the immediate plunge into demanding work, though experienced more extremely in medieval times, echoes in modern experience. We still wake reluctant, still find mornings challenging, still must overcome inertia to engage with the day. The scale differs, but the fundamental pattern persists. This continuity across centuries suggests something essential about human nature rather than merely about circumstances. The seasonal cycle from winter's harshness to spring's renewal provided a framework for understanding life itself. Hardship was temporary, suffering had limits, endurance brought reward. This cycle repeated annually, teaching and reinforcing these lessons. Modern life, with its climate control and constant availability of food, has muted these seasonal rhythms. We have gained comfort, but perhaps lost some of the profound hope that comes from watching winter inevitably transform into spring. The specific sleeping practices I have described, straw mattresses and woolen blankets, communal beds and warming stones, protective prayers and iron charms, these belong to their time and place. They would be impractical and unnecessary in the modern world. Yet the principles underlying them remain relevant. The importance of preparation, the value of community, the need for both practical and psychological defenses against life's challenges. If there is wisdom to extract from these ancient sleeping practices, it is perhaps this: comfort is relative, suffering is survivable, and human ingenuity combined with human connection can overcome remarkable obstacles. The people of medieval Rus did not merely endure winter. They developed sophisticated systems, both practical and cultural, that transformed brutal survival into something approaching livable existence. Their nights were never comfortable by modern standards, yet they were bearable. Their sleep was interrupted, cold invaded, and often fear-tinged, yet it was sufficient to sustain life. They asked not for luxury, but for adequacy, and through careful preparation and communal support, they achieved it. I think often about the courage required to face winter after winter, knowing what horrors awaited, yet continuing to prepare, to hope, to persist. This was not dramatic heroism, but quiet, persistent determination, the decision each autumn to gather wood and store food, knowing these preparations might prove inadequate, but making them anyway, because the alternative was surrender. The children I watched grow up in those harsh conditions, who learned from infancy that survival required effort and that comfort was earned rather than assumed, developed resilience that served them throughout their lives. They understood that resources were limited, that sharing was essential, that each person's welfare depended on the community's collective effort. These lessons, learned tangibly through cold nights and shared beds, shaped character in ways that abstract teaching never could. The elderly who survived multiple winters carried hard-won wisdom. They knew which remedies worked, which prayers brought comfort, how to read weather signs and pace resources through the long season. This knowledge, transmitted to younger generations, represented continuity and hope, proof that winter could be survived because many had survived it before. The losses to deserve remembrance, Not everyone made it through. The very young and very old, the ill and the unlucky, fell victim to cold or hunger or disease, despite every effort to save them. These deaths were not meaningless, but were incorporated into the community's ongoing story. Remembered in prayers and tales, their lives honored by the survivors' determination to persist. As I conclude this long remembrance, I am aware of how much remains untold. Each household had its own variations, each region its adaptations, each person their individual experience of those winter nights. I have attempted to paint a representative picture, blending specific memories with general patterns, but the full diversity of experience exceeds any single account. What I hope I have conveyed is the visceral reality of medieval winter sleep, not romanticized into adventure, nor dismissed as mere suffering, but understood as complex experience, mixing hardship and adaptation, fear and hope, discomfort and determination. These people were neither heroes nor victims, but humans facing their circumstances with whatever resources they could muster. Their story matters, not merely as historical curiosity, but as testimony to human resilience. We face our own challenges today, different in form, but similar in requiring courage and adaptation. The strategies may change, but the fundamental human response to prepare, to persist, to care for each other, to find meaning in struggle, remains constant across time. So as you prepare for your own sleep tonight, in your comfortable, heated room, with your soft mattress and clean sheets, spare a thought for those who came before. Remember the medieval families huddled under wool and fur, the communal warmth of bodies pressed together, the prayers whispered into darkness, the fires tended through long nights. Remember that comfort is not humanity's natural state, but rather a hard-won achievement, and that those who lacked it, nevertheless, found ways to endure. Their endurance made your existence possible. Every person alive today descends from ancestors who survived winter after winter, who found warmth enough to live through cold nights, who persisted despite hardship. You carry in your body the legacy of their resilience, encoded in the very genes that determine your circadian rhythms and temperature regulation. The eternal rhythm continues. Day follows night. Spring follows winter. Survival remains the fundamental task. The forms change, the tools improve, the comforts multiply, but the underlying pattern persists. We sleep, we wake, we face challenges, we adapt, we endure. This is the human story, told here through the specific lens of medieval Russ, but recognizable in all times and places. As darkness falls wherever you are, as you prepare for your own night's rest, you participate in this ancient rhythm. You lie down as countless generations have lied down before you, surrendering to sleep's vulnerability, trusting that morning will come. The specific circumstances differ dramatically from those medieval winters, yet the essential act, the nightly laying down of consciousness in hope of renewal, remains unchanged. And so the story comes full circle. We began with winter's onset, followed the people of ancient Rus through their strategies for surviving cold nights, and arrived at spring's renewal. This cycle repeats endlessly, as reliable as the turning of seasons, as certain as the sun's daily journey across the sky. Winter will always come, and humans will always seek warmth. The details shift, but the pattern endures.